Брифинге в Министерстве иностранных дел России, пресс-центр. С нами российские и зарубежные корреспонденты. Прошу прощения, что мы несколько сегодня с ним задержали, но хотелось, опять же, подготовиться ко всем тем темам, которые вы обозначили в качестве вас интересующих. А новостей поступает каждый день огромное количество. Начнем с графика министра иностранных дел России Сергея Лаврова. Так, 17 февраля состоятся переговоры главы российского внешнеполитического ведомства с его коллегой, министром иностранных дел Республики Сербия. Планируется углубленный обмен мнениями по российско-сербским многоплановым отношениям, взаимодействию. Конечно, ситуация в Kosovo и в целом на Балканах. Ну и стороны, естественно, обменяются мнениями по широкому спектру международных тем. Также 17 февраля министр иностранных дел России Сергей Лавров примет участие в церемонии награждения ведомственными наградами представителей региональных властей, российских общественных деятелей, руководителей территориальных органов МИД России в Екатеринбурге, Казани.
With the states of unfavorable for external conditions for its social and economic development, defending the rights of Russian citizens and compatriots who live abroad. A starting meeting of the G20 foreign policy chiefs within the framework of the first presidency of our friends and associates from South Africa is in the works. And this year it will take place in Johannesburg in South Africa from February the 20th to February the 21st. This is a landmark event not only for Pretoria but also for the entire African continent, which for the first time will be hosting the events related to the G20. The Russian delegation is scheduled to be headed by Minister of Foreign Affairs of our country, Sergei Lavrov. It is expected that the majority of members of this leading economic forum, as well as a wide range of invited states and international organizations, will be represented at a similar level. The debates will open with an address by the President of South Africa, who will set the general tune for the discussion of global challenges and threats, and of course special attention will be paid to the international situation, which is deteriorating under the influence of the confrontational policy of neoliberal Western elites. The parties will address pressing issues of integrity and effective functioning of the global economic system, and the priorities set by South Africans are designed to stimulate economic growth, reduce inequalities and imbalances, ensure equitable access to finance for the countries of the Global South. Such a framework base will be Pretoria's slogan, which it has outlined in support of solidarity, equality and sustainable development. And in doing so, South Africa follows in the footsteps of the chairmanships of its predecessors from the world majority states from 2022 to 2024, Indonesia, India and Brazil. This refers in particular to the G20's significant contribution during this period to strengthening the foundations of a multipolar world and democratizing global economic institutions in the interests of new non-Western centers of influence, especially the newly enlarged BRICS. Key guidelines for the exchanges are the upcoming anniversaries, of course the 80th anniversary of the victory in World War II, the establishment of the United Nations, the 65th anniversary of the adoption by our initiative of the Declaration on Decolonization, which ensured the independence and consolidation of its independence in Africa. The Minister's remark will provide a detailed analysis of the international situation with a focus on the root causes of the events that were observed and are observed now. Crises and conflicts, concrete steps will be outlined to overcome destructive phenomena. The Russian side will reaffirm its policy of maintaining the central role of the United Nations in world affairs. As well, once again, we will emphasize the importance of strict observance of the principles of the UN Charter in their interrelation and entirety. We will also emphasize the need that there is no alternative to respectful interstate cooperation, no alternative to providing indivisible and equal security for all. We intend also once again to call for maintaining an open global economy and reject trade wars, illegitimate, illegal, criminal sanctions, and other manifestations of unfair competition. And of course, certain attention will be paid to the problems related to the groups that are building based on honesty without diktat, without blackmail, such as the EAU, the SCU, and the BRICS. And considerable attention will be paid to the matter of the Russian initiative of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. As it usually happens on the sidelines of the G20 meetings, a number of contacts are planned between the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation and his colleagues. Now we will speak about the crisis in Ukraine. The AFU terrorists continue their terrorist activities against the population. In February, as a result of a strike of a drone in Valuski district of the Belgorod region, a man and 2 women died. They had 18 and 14 years. On February the 8th, the Ukrainian armed forces launched an inhuman artillery strike on a densely populated area of Makiivka in Donetsk, the DPR, which had tragic consequences. A woman died. Her young daughter was gravely injured. 10 other people were injured, including 1 child. On February the 10th, the bandits fired several dozen different munitions and used drones on 26 settlements in Belgorod region. 2 men were wounded. Infrastructure and technological equipment were damaged. On the same day, as a result of a deliberate drone attack on the highway Mikhailovka-Vasilievka in Zaporozhye region, two elderly people were injured who traveled with their little grandson. Fortunately, the boy was unscathed. A resident of the liberated town of Novogrodovka, DPR, told journalists about how the AFU militants cynically used him to check for mines. Just imagine, to check for mines in residential premises. A child had, as was intended by the bandits, to become a human detector of whether it was possible to walk through that territory or whether it was mined. What does it resemble? Only one thing. This is how the Nazis acted in the 20th century. This is how the neo-Nazis act in the 21st century. As Kursk region is being liberated, new atrocities by the Ukrainian Nazis are being uncovered. In a house in the Sudzhan district, a body of a tortured and murdered veteran of the Great Patriotic War was found. He survived the Nazis, but he could not survive the neo-Nazis. And there will be a retribution for all that. We have testimonies from the soldiers of the 83rd Independent Guards Airborne Assault Brigade who liberated at the end of January the village of Nikolaevo-Daryino in the very same Sudzhan district of the Kursk region. Its residents were used by the Ukraine Nazis as human shields. They were deprived of assistance, were subjected to abuse. In the end, the Ukrainian armed forces monsters killed almost all the men. Only one man miraculously survived, and several other women from the village who were evacuated, as well as him, recounted the details of these horrific events. The world thought that the Belarusian village of Khatyn is the very alarm bells that should prevent people from forgetting how deeply inhuman the population of Earth can become under these nationalistic Nazi slogans. But it turns out these alarm bells, these bells in Khatyn, did not reach everyone. The abuse, the atrocities, the crimes that are being committed against civilians in the Kursk region by neo-Nazis of the Kiev regime is a crime without a term of expiry. It is a true crime committed by the neo-Nazis. It is a crime that on the one side has all the signs of being a genocide on national grounds and based on the signature of those who committed it. And at the same time, they have all the signs of being committed by humans who profess terrorism. But the neo-Nazis will be punished for these and other crimes. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for war crimes. A life sentence in absentia was given to the commander of the 138th Anti-Aircraft Brigade of the Air Command of the AFU, Dieman, on whose order on February 23, 2024, a missile attack was carried out against the farm Trudovaya Armenia in the Krasnodar region. As a result of the terrorist attack, 10 people were killed. To 13.5, 14, and 14.5 years in prison in absentia were sentenced mercenaries from Georgia Tornike Okropyelashvili, Gvanse Gelashvili, and Valikoy Zoria. I would like to note that the flag belonging to the so-called soldiers of flag from Georgia was found by law enforcement agencies in the basement with brutally murdered residents of the Kursk village of Ruskaya Porechnya. We spoke about this crime by the Kiev regime in detail at a briefing on January 31st this year. 13 years and 9 months and 14 years in prison, respectively, received Latvian and Lithuanian so-called legionnaires Zygmars Ronis and Albertas Glazaukas. They fought in the battalions of Carpathian Sich and the Kastus Kalinowski Regiment. All the perpetrators were put on international wanted lists. Russian law enforcement agencies continue to work to bring Ukraine Nazis and foreign mercenaries to justice for war crimes and other crimes. And by the way, every time we speak about these crimes, and every time we speak about the punishment that awaits their perpetrators, and we will continue to do so, we can see how these Western leaders rubber stamp decisions to support the Kiev Nazis with money and weapons, how they contribute to crimes against humanity. And they will not escape responsibility for their actions. You can see what are the components of their responsibility. On the 12th of February, a regular meeting of the contact group for defense assistance to Ukraine in the Ramstein format was held in Brussels, and for the first time, instead of the head of the Pentagon, the British defense minister took the chair. Thus, he emphasized his readiness to assume the role of the main director of the West's war against Russia by the hands of the Ukrainians. However, it appears that they have a lot of problems, these Western strategists. This castle should be considered only as an element of a chess combination, as on February the 6th, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jim Townsend stressed in an interview with Politico, Britain can coordinate aid to Ukraine, but he said there will be no money and thus no aid itself without the United States. There were rumors on the sidelines of Ramstein that its meeting on Wednesday turned out to be the worst for Ukraine. I don't know what is worse, not to supply Kiev with military assistance in the volumes Zelensky insists on, or to supply it. From Western point of view, it is worse, apparently, not to supply this assistance. We are talking about another thing. If somebody in the West has at least a little bit of compassion towards Ukraine as a state, towards Ukrainians as people, as residents of those territories, as citizens of Ukraine, then they should spare them and will not do everything in their power to destroy them all, because it is precisely the aim of Zelensky using this Western money. As part of Ramstein, only the British decided to splurge on aid to Ukraine, promising to allocate $186 million. For the Kiev, who is killing its own citizens, this is a drop in the ocean, because only to hold the front line every month it spends more than $3 billion a month. Simply count.
Just make some calculations. Over 30 billion a year is what Ukraine would need, and how much buildings could be constructed for the citizens of Ukraine, how many schools, how many plants and factories, how much could be invested into new technologies, into the settlement of urgent issues, not only in the field of high-tech, but simply this money could be spent in order to settle the routine problems of Ukraine, how many roads and airports could be constructed. But it's not going to happen. Ukraine is to have a different future, according to the West. The West decided that Ukraine should have a different future. London seeks to have a new leader role, so the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the UK, David Lammy, during his visit to Kiev some days ago, embarrassed himself. He wanted to demonstrate his erudition, but he happened to say that there was a century and then 1,000-year-long history of the partnership between the Englishman and the old Ukrainians, as he put it. He is a victim of UK education and probably of UK science too. According to him, 1,000 years ago, according to the British Foreign Minister, Kiev princesses married British princes. It was a quote. I believe that professional historians couldn't believe their eyes. Probably they tried to clarify the origin of this fake information, and when they realized that this statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the UK, and I believe that soon the title of the head of the Foreign Office of the UK will sound as a verdict. So the scientists didn't believe their ears, and they found out, in order to recall to the UK Foreign Minister, that 1,000 years ago Ukraine didn't exist as a state. There was an old Russian state called Rus, but it had nothing to do with Ukraine. Indeed, Russian princesses indeed entered dynastic marriages. But the issue is, probably someone will inform Mr. Lammy about it, they never married Anglo-Saxons. On the other hand, it might be the case that what Mr. Lammy wanted to say, that all ancient Ukrainian princesses married. Well, maybe he thought that Americans also existed thousands of years ago. Well, in the chronicles, there are records about an opposite case. In the 11th century, a Russian prince, Vladimir Monomach, married an English princess, Githa of Wessex. Who was she? She was the daughter of King Harold II, killed by Normans during the Battle of Hastings. But what Mr. Lammy was talking about never happened. Of course, we understand that the British do cherish imperial ambitions, and they can speak about things that are non-existent, about things that have no historical evidence, about the histories of cooperation with their vessels, and apparently those vessels are ready to listen to anything. But what we see behind these chronicles is a simple political calculation. He wants to push the Ukrainian regime to continue the hostilities against Russia. But the people in Ukraine have been tortured by the Kiev regime to such an extent, they have been brainwashed by the West to such an extent that probably after they've heard these words by Foreign Minister Mr. Lammy, probably they believed it. Something different that emerged from this same myth production machine. There was a declaration about the first anniversary of the creation of a so-called international coalition to return Ukrainian kids. The coalition between Canada and Ukraine. Well, over the past time, such a great number of empty bodies were launched that did nothing other than rubber-stomping documents and Russophobic statements. So it is surprising how they manage not to confuse these documents. The so-called coalition, according to its founders, contributed to the return of 600 children to Ukraine in 2024. It is something that they claim as evidence. But there are no grounds for no evidence. There is no evidence for these figures. So let's try to find out what is behind these figures. Let me remind you that in Russia there is a clear algorithm that was developed by the special representative of the President for Children's Rights, Madam Lvova Belova, with cooperation with the Ukrainian side and with facilitation of international mediators such as Qatar, Vatican, and International Committee of the Red Cross. As a result, 87 children from 69 families reunited with their relatives in Ukraine in 3 countries, and 15 children from 10 families returned to their families in Russia. So we are not talking about hundreds of children. Why did the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and Canada speak about hundreds of children? Even if they were talking about other minors, there have been checks, and it was established that they never separated from their relatives. They entered Russia together with their family members, and in some cases they didn't move anywhere. They are simply considered by the Zelensky regime as deported persons because they live in the territories that reunified with Russia following the referendum in September 2022. It is obvious that these children in these territories no longer have anything to do with Ukraine. But let's get back to this figure of alleged 600 children who have been returned home. Whom are they talking about? Why are they talking about these hundreds of children? I've shared with you the Russian statistics. These statistics are regularly provided by Madame Lvova-Belova. So why are they talking about hundreds of children? I can assume that they are talking about the children who were taken out of their families in European countries, in the countries of the European Union. But let's state it clearly. In August 2024, the National Service of Ukraine reported that it counts 430 such children, and we have grounds to believe that in reality the number of such cases is much greater. That's how you should present these facts. Hundreds of children who've been separated from their families have nothing to do with Russia. They are spread all over the Western countries, NATO countries. We hope that all these children will be indeed returned to their families, but Russia has nothing to do with it. Let Brussels deal with it. Let Brussels report to the international community why and how it so happened that in their territories there are minors who have been separated from their parents. Probably it would be meaningful and reasonable once the Kiev regime and its masters in the West keep referring to the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, probably they should raise this issue about the separated children with the International Criminal Court. And something that alarmed the world. For many years, we had been trying to squeeze this international body, the USAID, from Russia, but the facts revealed recently are alarming. There have been publications about the details about the activities of this body. The USAID is an agency that was engaged in, so to say, international development. What is international development? It is facilitation of educational projects, facilitation of economic development, and resolutions of issues related to poverty, famine, and probably something related to security. But what did USAID do in Ukraine? Look at the figures provided by the U.S. Department of State. From 2021 to 2022, the Ukraine track was a priority one for the agency. It accounted for 21% of all of its assistance, worth $30.6 billion. So let's see where this money went to. The lion's share of entire funds, $24.1 billion, was aimed at maintaining the so-called macroeconomic stability. It was done in coordination with the World Bank. However, in the context of a growing real deficit, the budget of 40%, only 21% of real needs were covered. So even Kiev regime had questions regarding the efficiency of this assistance. Imagine the US allocated money, sent it to Ukraine, and they did understand that it was not an effective tool to resolve the economic problems. So why did they continue to do so? Why didn't they spend this money for something useful? The answer is simple: it is a corruption scheme. But the agency had enough time and money for different initiatives. The Ukraine information field was free from any alternative points of view. According to WikiLeaks, around 6,200 journalists from 707 media were at a payroll. Imagine, over 6,000 journalists were paid by this agency, by the USAID, as well as 979 NGOs who received similar assistance, financial assistance. Money was provided and allocated to the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, local bodies, and those in charge of persecution of canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in particular the so-called Center for Economic and Political Studies, named after Razumkov, regularly issued sociological studies pointing to the support of the Ukrainian society of the schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Now it's clear why and how this schism occurred in Ukraine. But in reality, it's not a schism. It is an elimination of orthodoxy in Ukraine. USAID was involved in it in particular. As it turned out, the USAID acted through David Michael Bonn, who even didn't have a legal education in law. And for 15 years, he tried to readjust the justice system in Ukraine. Other fraudulent schemes of this body involve pseudo-accounting for the weapons provided to Ukraine, as well as attempts to gain access to the frozen Russian assets. There have been information reports about in the social networks that after the beginning of the special military operation, the USAID sponsored travels of Hollywood stars to Ukraine. It was done in order to draw the attention of the Western audience to the democratic transitions in Ukraine and in order to praise Mr. Zelensky. I'm talking about the propaganda tours by Angelina Jolie, Orlando Bloom, Sean Penn, Ben Stiller, Jean-Claude Van Damme. It all cost Washington $38.5 million US. But remember how it was presented to the audience. According to them, the American public figures inspired by the democratic transitions in Ukraine and sympathetic with the Ukrainian peoples wanted to support it with their tours, with communication and meetings. They tried to present it in a beautiful way. The international world community was witnessing these beautiful reports about fantastic tolerance that all these so-called stars that I have mentioned felt and translated into reality in the face of the atrocities experienced and suffered by the Ukrainian people. They've never seen these atrocities in reality. They didn't want to know that for decades, the Zelensky regime had been killing the people and eliminated the statehood of Ukraine. They persecuted people for their ethnicity. They banned national languages and made attempts to rewrite and revise national history. They couldn't see it. What they saw was the beautiful picture that the USAID paid them to see. You know, the name for those who love for money. Now let's talk about the ongoing funding from the US. According to the media, Ukraine continues to receive money that was approved by the previous US administration of Joe Biden. Mr. Zelensky tries to persuade the Western allies to resume the military supplies, and he stressed that the stop of these deliveries might lead to a situation when Ukraine loses its territories. How can he not understand that he's already lost his country and his people? Why? Because until that time, even early, Zelensky lost his conscience. Let me remind you that in September 2025, throughout Lebanon, there was a massive explosion of pagers, and now we see that Kiev tries to take over the tactics employed by Israel. Tel Aviv admitted that this campaign with the pagers was a planned campaign against Hezbollah. Since that time, our militaries started detecting the facts of deliberate mining of furniture in the houses, in residential houses. Pieces of furniture were mined in the houses that were left over in the villages of Donbass. Explosive devices are incorporated into some pieces of furniture. And there are also recordings that spread familiar noises, such as calls for assistance. These calls are supposed to draw the attention of the people around.
People with compassion will not pass by, but when someone tries to open such a piece of furniture, a closet, for example, or some other device, then there will inevitably be an explosion. There are many cases when such tactics were used by terrorists. Now, the AFU have begun to use it on a frequent basis. In the same vein, we receive reports about the delivery of booby-trapped FPV goggles of the Cobra model produced by Skyzone, in which improvised explosive devices with a capacity of 10-15 grams of plastic explosive were found. There is reason to believe that this is the work of the Ukrainian secret services, who use volunteers, with the volunteers none the wiser, in order to plant booby-trapped equipment during the purchase of aid for the front. But once again, this emphasizes the terrorist character of the Kiev regime and the AFU and battalions under its control. Also continues the fight against the monuments in Ukraine. On February 5th in Kharkiv, a monument dedicated to Galina Nikitina, who was shot there in February 1942 by the Gestapo, was demolished. The cynical pretext for this action drew attention. It was explained by the monument symbolizing, just think, a repressive regime which tried to destroy Ukrainian national identity and culture. Such false, fake propaganda nonsense is what Nazis precisely have always used to justify their atrocities and cruelty. They have only one identity: hatred, a false sense of being exceptional, and the destruction of everything that does not fit into that concept. All these facts that I've mentioned, all the things that we will talk about today, all this confirms the relevance of the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. All its objectives, as Russian leadership have repeatedly stated, will definitely be achieved. We can see the moral support from NATO-centric structures to their Ukrainian subordinates. When we talk about NATO-centric structures, we not only speak about members, but also about all those who spread and propagate this destructive logic of the NATO. The correspondent of the ABC, with a beautiful name of the movie Fortitude, was shown in prime time on February the 10th this year, and this movie, The Fortitude, was dedicated to the special military operation in Ukraine. I would like to note that this is an ugly brainchild of Australian documentary journalism, although the journalism there died after such a fake story was ascribed to it. All this is evidence of the level to which ABC propaganda journalism has stooped to. Correspondent Willis was reporting from an AFU bunker, and he invited the viewers to watch in great detail the remote killing of a Russian soldier by kamikaze drones. These words, spoken, such as "kill Russians," were repeatedly, obsessively mentioned throughout the movie, sometimes accompanied by mocking laughter. Where did we hear it? George Bush, the senior, spoke about it in a broadcast when he said, thinking that he spoke to representatives of the Kiev regime, he said that it was the purpose of modern Ukraine to kill as many Russians as possible. The ABC is well known for relentlessly brainwashing its audience, demonizing Russia, and glossing in every possible way over the responsibility of the West and its Kiev puppets for the crimes in Ukraine. Let's call things by their proper names. This media outlet in Australia openly promotes ethnic hatred and spreads blatant lies. Naturally, prejudiced hostility from the Australian media mainstream against Russia is nothing new, but the ABC has brought it to the point of true Russophobia and true Nazism. Even though only a few days ago the Australian Federal Parliament passed a law toughening penalties for crimes motivated by national hatred. Or is national hatred also segregated? Are the nationalities against which one cannot show hatred? But from the point of view of the officials in Australia, it seems that they are nationalities that should actually evoke hatred. Again, in terms of our people, we see that the Australian media are spreading this hatred. Another couple of words about USAID. This is a fantastic story. I believe books will be written and selections or even documentaries will be published, as well as reports and full-scale movies will be created about the topic of how, for years, this organization, USAID, lied to people and for money bought people who became conductors of lies, falsehoods, disinformation, and obviously committed crimes against conscience. Now we have been speaking about the actions of the USAID in Ukraine, its propaganda, its acquisition, bribing of people and journalists. It paid media, NGOs, and governmental structures, made judicial reforms. Perhaps this is not the most horrific act that the USAID has committed. I will now cite a number of examples that can be discussed in separate. In terms of horrific criminality, we are talking about military biological activities of the US outside of their territories. It was carried out under the guise of developing national systems of sanitary and epidemiological surveillance and countering threats of biological terrorism in different countries. Such dangerous activity, as you know, was being carried out in many countries of the world, including some states of the former Soviet Union, and a blatant example of the above-mentioned activities of the United States were the cases uncovered as a result of the special military operation of the implementation in violation of the Convention on the Prohibition of Biological and Toxic Weapons of the Pentagon's biological military programs on Ukrainian territory. We have spoken about it. The Minister of Defense of Russia spoke about it. Brilliantly, this topic was covered and expounded on by the Chief of the Radiological, Chemical and Biological Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who fell victim to a terrorist attack. A fundamental contribution to exposing the unlawful actions of the United States was made by the Parliamentary Commission for investigating the circumstances surrounding the establishment by United States specialists of biological laboratories on the territory of Ukraine. Its work resulted in the publication of a detailed report prepared on the basis of the full range of available sources, including documents seized during the special military operations, results of interviews with numerous witnesses who had information about the activities of the Pentagon and related institutes in the Ukrainian biolaboratories. The above-mentioned documents indicate in particular the involvement, once again, of the United States Agency for Allegedly International Development, USAID, in the implementation of U.S. military biological activities. USAID programs were used to finance in-depth studies in Ukraine of antibiotic-resistant forms of tuberculosis. It cannot even be imagined. We are talking about an agency that was supposed, in accordance to its mandate, to send money for international development. But as part of the aforementioned studies, a protocol was created for research on resistance to anti-tuberculosis medicine. At the same time, work was carried out to identify new possible routes. You cannot believe it, but we have to believe it because it was proved by documents. New possible routes of infection with a highly resistant strain of tuberculosis. So this is a diversion. These diversive activities were carried out by the USAID in Ukraine. To clarify all aspects of US biological military activity in Ukraine, Russia applies diverse efforts in the international arena. We initiated a consultative meeting on Article 5 of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. I would like to recall that it happened in September 2022 in Geneva, and also it was discussed on October 27th and November 2nd, 2022 in the UNSC and during the 9th Review Conference of the BTWC in December 2022. What do you think we heard in response? In response to our recent questions on the matter from the US, we heard nothing. We only saw how they tried to accuse us of misinformation and propaganda. Nothing substantial, as they are prone to say. Nothing corroborated by facts was heard. And what happens nowadays? Today, the US authorities themselves admit that Russian statements about the danger of US military and biological activities have turned out to be true. The recent comment from Washington about the involvement of the USAID in financing development of biological weapons only confirms the validity of our claims in connection with US biological military activities in close proximity to Russian territories. We hope that this information will allow us to get from the US, and I would like to recall that they are one of the depositories of the BTWC, appropriate answers to the questions we have raised, and will allow to resolve this unsightly situation and ensure that Washington complies with its obligations under the Convention. The things that American officials and public figures are concealing horrifies the very same people of America. This is the point of truth. This is the truth that the Americans are learning now about themselves, what they have been involved in by the neoliberal regimes, why taxes were collected and where they were allocated to, how destructive and mocking of their own principles and slogans was carried out under the guise of defending human rights, the new normal, tolerance, and democracy. Another example, Slovakia. Prime Minister Fico has more than once publicly spoken about direct interference from external forces in the internal political life of the country in an attempt to overthrow the current coalition government. Why? In his words, the West does not want to accept the sovereign policy of Slovakia, including when it comes to its attitude towards the situation in Ukraine and its relations with Russia. From Slovak media, we know that Robert Fico bases his statements on data received from the local intelligence services. Bratislava is seriously concerned about the degree of foreign intrusion and influence on internal processes in the country. Inter alia, I guess, through USAID in 2018, the Slovak Ministry of Foreign Affairs signed a memorandum of understanding with the agency, and in 2022 the document was extended for a new 3-year term. Robert Fico published in this regard an open letter he addressed it to the new US administration, where he welcomed the decision to terminate the activities of the agency, whose resources, quote, were among other things used for political gain in Slovakia in order to deform the political system and support certain political parties. Subsidies, grants, worth several $1 million, according to the Slovak Prime Minister, were provided to NGOs, media outlets, and individual journalists working in Slovakia, not based on equal access, but rather based on the political conjunctive, segregation, and selectivity. Currently, Slovak law enforcement authorities are looking into the matter. As it turns out, the former Slovak government also provided direct financial support to Georgian NGOs as well. It is possible Bratislava suggests that it was the funds intended for the implementation of USAID so-called humanitarian projects that were used in the organization of the recent mass anti-government riots that had swept across Slovakia. But that is not all. It seems this will be a separate section of our briefing. A new one, USAID. Look what happened in Albania. Recently, we saw figures that show how much the agency spent on the maintenance of its agents of influence in the Balkan states. In particular, I would like to emphasize these are not figures invented by Russian hackers. These are not anonymous materials. These are official statistics that were published officially on Albania. Only in the last 4 years alone, almost $200 million US dollars has been spent to create a pro-American layer in Tirana in state and public institutes. Relevant data. Who was it made public for? By Richard Grenell, U.S. Special Envoy for the Organization of Diplomatic Institutions. For the Western Balkans alone, almost 2 billion was spent. Once again, this information was published by Richard Grenell, the very same Grenell who was US ambassador in Germany. Horrendous corruption schemes are being uncovered where Albania was relegated by the agency to the role of some kind of a laundering haven for very large sums of money that were going through the USAID. Local investigative journalists, having studied the published data, have come to the conclusion that funds intended on paper for humanitarian projects were transferred through a number of front persons to the institutes of WHO, of George Soros, and other NGOs. Some of the money, judging by the documents, went directly to the state authorities, including the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the courts of Albania. Most strikingly, truly surprises us, but it was also paid directly to the Anti-Corruption Agency of Albania so that it would not investigate the millions of dollars that flowed through the unscrupulous hands of overseas grantors. How do you believe after this a regime in a country will formulate its position? Of course, they will formulate it on Ukraine, for example, not based on reality and facts and interests of their own people. They will formulate the position of their country guided by the interest of those who provide them with those millions. And those who provide them with those millions, for example, USAID, together with the money put into the envelopes, methodic books that are to be used by those regimes. This is why they are being copy-pasted all over NATO countries. This is why they are used by media outlets, journalists, NGOs, because all those people were paid. On the one side, a text was printed in support of the Ukrainian regime, but on the other side, a US dollar was attached. It all went through the USAID. All of this has come to light in the last week, but there is no doubt that similar schemes, which have nothing to do with legality, support for democracy, or humanitarian work, have been practiced in many countries and regions of the world for decades. And this is the money of American taxpayers, and these American taxpayers had no idea what their taxes were being spent on.
Look how they treat military pensioners in the Baltic states. It was on several occasions that we touched upon this topic, and we continue to take active efforts in order to unblock the crisis situation created by the Baltic authorities in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The principled position of our country was presented to the foreign policy agencies of the Baltic states in our contacts with the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We handed over the notes in which we committed our adherence to the international obligations under intergovernmental treaties with Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn about social guarantees and protections for military pensioners. We stress that it is Baltic authorities that are responsible for this artificial crisis. In particular, the Swed Bank refuses to accept payments from the Russian banks who are under illegitimate sanctions. The Russian diplomatic missions in the three countries meet military pensioners in these countries, explain the true reasons for the problems with the financing, and will continue to do our utmost to make sure that this crisis is resolved as soon as possible. Talking about the Russophobia in some other countries, in particular, I'm going to talk about President of Italy. During his presentation in the Marshall University, a President of the Italian Republic made some insulting statements about our country. He drew outrageous and bluntly false historical parallels between the Russian Federation and the Nazi Germany, who called to take into account the failure of the Western policy aimed at appeasing the aggressor in the late 30s. When settling the Ukraine crisis, he said that Russian activities allegedly had a similar nature with the project of the Third Reich in Europe. It is striking to see such blasphemous statements from the President of Italy, a country that knows firsthand what fascism really is. Only they have a different history, a different lesson than we have. Our country was subjected to and attacked by the Hitler Germany, but our country not only managed to squeeze the enemy out from our territory, but also accompanied it to its home country, and we liberated Europe from fascism and Nazism, and we assisted European countries in restoring their territories, although our country was the one that needed the assistance. The Mussolini regime was a true ally of the Nazi Germany under the still anti-Comintern and the Berlin Pacts. It provided to the Third Reich 235,000 troops for the expeditionary force in order to conduct aggression against the USSR. Did President of Italy forget his history? I don't think so. Back in 1941 was when it all happened. The then regime in Italy bears joint responsibility with the Hitler regime for the genocide against the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War. President of Italy should remember that today Italy, together with other NATO countries, pumps the terrorist neo-Nazi Kiev regime with modern lethal weapons and supports the criminal neo-Nazi regime in all its crimes. The Zelensky regime is founded on the same hatred ideas, although they are formulated and implemented in a different way thanks to the NATO assistance. But the essence is the same: a segregation of people based on their ethnicity, their religion, their language, their culture, respect for their traditions and history. Same was promoted by Hitler and his accomplices in all forms and manifestations, be it his allies on the state level or simply collaborators. But we know a different Italy. We know Italians who, during World War II, organized strong partisan movements and actively participated in these partisan movements. Thousands of Soviet people were partisans too. I'm talking about prisoners of war and deported civilians who fought together with their Italian compatriots against fascism and gave their lives in order to liberate Italy and their motherland. By various estimates, out of 12,000 of foreign participants of the Italian resistance movement, about half were Soviet citizens. Did Mr. President mention it? 13 heroes were awarded Italian state awards. It is shameful not to know and own history. Statements by Mr. Mattarella not only insult their memory, but also the memory of all Italian anti-fascists, their ancestors in Russia, their descendants in Russia and in Italy, and all those who know it find these analogies unacceptable. But I know that, to put it mildly, not all in Italy do share such odious assessments. On the 4th of February, in Rizon, the city authorities, together with the Consulate General of Russia in Genoa, held a 5th international conference entitled Peoples of the USSR and European Countries in the Fight Against Neo-Fascism during World War II. The event brought together Italian representatives who know the real history, not only those who cherish it but are ready to uphold the historical truth. Russia and Italy cherish the memory of Soviet and Italian heroes, partisans who gave their lives in fight against Nazism and fascism and all the crimes of the 20th century. Well, Russophobia is a true pandemic of a modern world. We regularly speak about cooperation between the Russian MFA with patriotic bodies, in particular the Russian Military Historical Society. Recently, there was a presentation of the publication entitled Black Book, A Brief History of Swedish and Finnish Russophobia. It is the 4th edition. It was prepared by the Russian Military Historical Society and is dedicated to the Russophobia in Sweden and Finland from the Middle Ages to the present time. It is a continuation in the series of publications by the Society. The exhibitions demonstrated in 2023 and 2024 near the embassies of Sweden and Finland in Moscow. I'll put it frankly. According to the historians, teachers and diplomatic servants, it is much more pleasant to talk about cooperation between the countries, about the points of affinity and cooperation between our peoples, about the projects that are viable, have a future. But when we see such an attack against our country, everywhere, in all fields, starting from terrorist attacks and up to the attempts to revise history, to cancel us. Faced with these attempts, we'll speak about how we oppose these attempts. The Third Reich was delivered with iron ore and other resources from Sweden. That's what we informed you about 3 years ago. Then it was our reaction to the boycott on the part of Swedish port officers, the boycott against Russian vessels from St. Petersburg. There were parallels to the situation during World War II. Now, thanks to the publication by the Russian Military Historical Society, we know that at least until 1944, the Russophobia pushed the Stockholm elites to support the neutrality policy that was favorable to Hitler and to try to push the border of the leadership of Helsinki tried to expand its borders eastwards and establish a greater Finland. We are sure it will be a true revelation about the crimes committed by the Finnish army, the facts of genocide. In the occupied territories, there were labor camps, and about half of them were Slavic populations. The lethality, according to various estimates, was even higher than the fascist camps. We didn't forget that Finnish authorities participated in the blockade of Leningrad and bear equal responsibility with the Germans for the genocide of Leningrad citizens. In 1941 in Berlin, a book was published entitled The Finland's Lebensraum. It was done upon the instruction of the President of Finland, Risto Ryti. This masterpiece was written by historian Eino Jutikala, geographer Vainio Auero, and ethnographer Kustaa Vilkuna. According to them, they provided historic facts, but in reality, they only have a pseudo-historical evidence. Finland had legitimate territorial claims for the northeast of Russia. It makes us look differently at the energetic and determined support provided by Helsinki and Stockholm to the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. Thanks to the publication, we can see parallels with the primordial Russophobic sentiments from the previous centuries. The neutrality was and mutual understanding was reached between our countries. After World War II, however, the adjoining NATO killed this neutrality. We hope the publication will soon be translated into English. It is now available on our website. In the section Historical Materials, you can see the publication Black Book, Atrocities by Banderovites in 1941-1945. It was published in 2022 and is translated into English. You can equally find a publication Black Book, Atrocities by Modern Banderovites and Ukrainian Neo-Nazis in 2014-2023. It is not translated into English yet. And you will also find a different publication entitled Black Book, Ukraine is not Russia, Ukrainian School Books of the 21st Century Methods and Mechanisms for Falsification of History. The publication analyzes the history books published in Ukraine. There are multiple examples which make it clear that school books are used in order to instill the ideology, neo-Banderovite ideology, on the children. The main of them is the desire to cross out, to eliminate from the history of Ukraine unpositive pages linked and related to Russia, and raise entire generations of young people in hatred towards Russia. You won't believe it, but it is an evidence, and there are proofs that, again, it was done with the use of the grants provided by the USAID and the Soros Foundation, and we have grounds to believe that their destructive mission will continue, and I assume those are not the last black books. But time will show at least the information, the data, the evidence that have been published in the most recent books about the publications made in the US about the activities of the USAID, bring someone to look deeper into the activities of the US and whether the US citizens need it. Another important historical topic. On the 13th of February 1945, one of the most brutal episodes of World War II happened. Hardly can Russia speak that something more brutal happened than the atrocities that took place in our country, how children and women were killed and villages were burned, how people were buried alive. But nonetheless, indiscriminate bombardments by the Anglo-Saxon aviation against Dresden will always stay in the history. For 3 days in a row, 800 heavy bombers dropped high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. As a result, 25,000 citizens died and the Dresden Picture Gallery was destroyed. Let me tell you, the masterpieces of the Dresden Gallery were restored by Soviet experts in our domestic museums. Step by step did our experts restore the masterpieces, only to return them to the German people. And we see how the German people thanked us. Well, definitely it's not the German people. It is done by those who implement the neoliberal policy. Unlike the Soviet commandment that spared the civilian population in the territories liberated, in Germany, the US and UK military commanders stick to a different ideology As a result, Dresden, that didn't have any military significance, we all know about it, and everyone knew it, was practically wiped off the map. The attack against Dresden was a shameful act of air terrorism and massive destruction of urban citizens. This atrocity is comparable with the atrocities committed by Hitler. Washington and London tried to justify it as a revenge for the crimes committed by the Nazis. But according to some historians, the true goal was to demonstrate to the Soviet troops who the most in the era was and intimidate the USSR. Our so-called allies already then were considering now confrontation with the Soviet Union. The same logic led to the destruction of Tokyo and the use of nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Think of what happened later to Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya and Syria, and now Ukraine, that fell victim to the NATO destructive mentality. Donbass, Novorossiya, their population has been eliminated by the Western weapons and with financial and military assistance of the West. The modern history science of Germany tried to forget about the tragic events of February 95 and shyly keep silent for political considerations about whose aircraft and upon whose instruction bombed Dresden. But it is not possible to conceal and rewrite history.
And another date, Budapest was liberated from the Nazi invaders on February 13, 1945, as a result of the Budapest Strategic Offensive Operation 80 years ago. In terms of ferocity and duration of street battles, 108 days and nights, the battle for the liberation of the Hungarian capital went down in the history of the Great Patriotic War as one of the most difficult operations of the Soviet troops. It involved the Second Ukrainian Front, part of the forces of the Third Ukrainian Front together with the Danube military flotilla. On the side of the Red Army fought units formed from Hungarian servicemen, volunteer regiment of Buda, a railroad construction detachment. The city was held by Hitler's troops, numbering up to 188,000 soldiers. On October 28, 1944, the order was given to start the operation, and in less than a month, the Red Army forced the Danube, surrounded Budapest. The command of the front, seeking to avoid unnecessary losses as well as to save the city from destruction, on December 29, 1944, offered its garrison to surrender, but the Soviet parliamentarians were dishonorably killed. Ilya Afanasyevich Ostapenko's group, which had passed the surrender demand to Buda, came under mortar fire. The car of Captain Nikolai Miklos Stepanovich Steinmetz, traveling under a white flag with a similar ultimatum to Pest, was shot with a machine gun. The leadership of the Third Reich concentrated large forces in the city and made active attempts to break the blockade, hoping to keep its last in the European continent ally. As a result of the ensuing bloody battles, on January 18, 1945, the Red Army liberated the plain-situated part of the city Pest, and on February 13th, the citadel of Buda. The city was considerably damaged, and all the bridges of the Danube had been blown up. The successful completion of the Budapest operation dramatically changed the strategic situation on the southern wing of the Soviet-German front and facilitated the Red Army offensive in the Berlin direction. Western historiography studiously glosses over the fact that the repulsion of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, which had taken the Western Allies troops by surprise, was greatly contributed to by the Red Army's powerful onslaught on the Eastern Front, undertaken also as part of the Budapest operation. Battles for the Hungarian capital began almost simultaneously with Hitler's Ardennes operation. In order to unblock the grouping of German-Hungarian troops surrounded on the outskirts of Budapest, the Wehrmacht command was forced to pull together forces and move some units directly from the Western Front. And on December 27, 1944, an order was given for an urgent redeployment to the east of 4 of the most combat-ready divisions, and from January 5, 1945, more than 400 combat aircraft as well. And this happened precisely when the Hitlerites were in dire need of reserves to develop their offensive in the Ardennes, which collapsed once and for all with the beginning of the large-scale Vistula order operation of the Soviet troops. The medal for the taking of Budapest was awarded to 362,000 people, and the feat of the Soviet soldiers at Budapest was sung in the well-known poem by Isakovsky, as you remember. Enemies burned the dear house down. Even against the backdrop of this turmoil, horrific turmoil, the revision of history, twisting of historical truth, demolition of monuments to heroes, even despite all that, there are good news. On the 10th of February, in the professional holiday of Russian diplomats, the Day of the Diplomat, the MFA Glav UPDK announced the fourth open competition entitled Diplomacy Architecture. There are some changes, even though this is not the first time the competition has been held, but for the first time it will be held in an international format. Young and child artists are being invited from age 12 to 35 from all over the world, professionals, amateur students, college students, students of creative courses and schools. Everyone is invited. The topic of this competition is diplomacy through the ages. The participants have to use artistic methods in order to manifest their vision of the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Especially for the participants and all those interested in history of diplomacy, in March there will be a series of online meetings with professors of the MFA Diplomatic Academy, and we will convey the timetable and topics additionally. In the year that we celebrate the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War, we welcome the use as a source of creative search, first and foremost, the topic of the Great Patriotic War, but everyone is free in the implementation of their creative potential. We will provide details in the text version of the briefing, but I can say that the winners of the competition will be determined in 2 nominations. Children artists from 12 to 18 and young artists from 18 to 35 years old. In the nomination Teenage Artists, the jury will select 5 best works, and in the nomination Young Artists, 15 works. The winners, as well as in other competitions, be it literature, political, and so on and so forth, will receive awards from Glav UPDK of the Russian MFA. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that works will be received for the competition until the 12th of May, and we invite media representatives to provide coverage for this event. And now I'm ready to answer your questions. Is международная жизнь here? Yes. Today, the Munich Conference on Security is beginning its work, and this is why I would like to ask if MFA representatives will be in Munich and whether negotiations with America announced by the US are scheduled. I would like to say, first and foremost, that Russian officials have not been invited to the Munich Security Conference. This decision was made some years ago. This is a politicized decision, a strange decision. The representatives of the MFA, as well as other Russian institutes, bodies, will not be present at the conference. I can tell you this with certainty. I reiterate and remind you, in this and in other years, after the start of the special military operation, Russia has not received invitations for this event. They put their stakes on the Kiev regime and not on the security policy. In my opinion, this is a colossal mistake of the very same format that from a political, social, analytical activity body has turned itself into a tool of carrying out absolutely destructive policies for European security. This is a very strange story, but it resembles the story about a snake that has not only bitten its own tail, but also has begun to devour itself. If they wanted a platform to criticize Russia, then perhaps they could spend a little less money, simply put on a microphone, and everyone could spit as far as he could. But if this is viewed as a possibility and an attempt to solve the questions related to security, then the conversation has to be serious and respectful, but also, most importantly, it should be based on a scientific foundation, because politics also is a science. Taking into account experience, they should not base their actions on pseudo-scientific and anti-scientific basis, disregarding the experience and the everyday realities. This is why some time ago, perhaps, the Munich conference was a place for serious discussion of political matters. Back then, there was a possibility to engage in an honest dialogue. It was not a simple monologue. Back then, it was not a place for harassment and persecution. It provided chances to speak about relevant problems on the European continent, about its security, openly, frankly, sincerely, and most importantly, cite facts instead of reading from methodical documents that the delegations of Western countries received from one single office in Brussels with their roles already delegated and assigned. Another mistake of this format is a conscious decision to reject multipolarity. They only sang praises to the rule-based world order without thinking about possible consequences. Today, other matters should be on the agenda, and they actually already are on the agenda. Few in the Munich conference are interested multipolarity, multiple centers, economy flagmans, centers of economic development, centers of civilizational impulses. These are the topics that should be discussed, not how to put a chair under Zelensky so that he could proclaim one thing or another. Only narrowly specialized experts are interested in how the neoliberal layer of the West tries to survive in the modern world, which is something that was propagandistically spoken about in the report prepared for the conference. Today, once again, I reiterate, other matters demand deep study, as well as another perspective: Eurasian security, overcoming new neocolonialistic practices, how to democratize relations, building a sustainable and just world order based on the existence of various centers of power in the world, creating a new architecture of international organizations. This is the agenda that is interesting and in demand. This is a priority for our country, for our partners. in the global East and South for the global majority. The major part of global expert debate is not carried out in the Munich conference, but in other platforms. If there was something that they could analyze, if they want to focus once again only on themselves, showing some egocentrism, then they could direct their attention to the USAID, for example, as an agency for international development, has become a terminal to pay for toppling regimes, interfering in internal affairs, and destabilizing situations. The Valdai Forum is an interested platform held in Russia, International Minsk Conference on Eurasian Security. Sebemias in the Emirates, the Forum on Antalya in Turkey, the Forum in Qatar, and other international forums. There is no smoking in the hall when someone is speaking about important matters that have divisive views on. There are no bribed participants that start to shut doors, start to shout or perform when they come to the tribune, when speakers propose to be closer to the real agenda and events. There is a culture which came, by the way, after holding such forums as the Munich conference. It did not survive in Munich, but it got preserved in these other platforms. The culture of dialogue, respect is being cultivated. Real problems are discussed instead of imaginary ones. These are the true politological platforms. Thank you. You said that the Munich conference is, in particular, being used in order to showcase Zelensky. It seems that he has used this opportunity because, first and foremost, at the conference he presented the new crimes committed by the Russians, the alleged strike by drones against the Chernobyl nuclear station. He also mentioned Bucha and other cases. In your opinion, is he trying to use the same trick as before? There is no doubt that Zelensky would not come empty-handed to the Munich conference. The hands of the Kiev regime are not only bloodied, but they also have to be constantly occupied by new shiny toys to distract the attention of the international participants. And the Munich conference remembers many such shiny toys. Poroshenko came with them as well. Zelensky introduced, by the way, sanctions against him recently. I would like to recall what was that Poroshenko came to the conference with, because it was a truly memorable event. One time he came with a part of a bus or a trolley. Do you recall? One time he came with a number of passports. Now Zelensky comes not with artifacts, but he seems to have upgraded the stakes. On the other hand, maybe it is a new law for him. He comes with a performance that is corroborated by provocations. I would like to remind you of this. We will use the materials of media outlets. Last year, before Munich, before the Munich conference, there was a provocation when there was a strike against a children's hospital in Kiev, and this provocation he brought as a starter for his new demand for money and attention. This time, and we have repeatedly said that, Kiev will repeatedly attack nuclear facilities because he considers civil nuclear infrastructure as a dirty nuclear weapon and professes nuclear terrorism. This time, this provocation was prepared. Is there any doubt for anyone that these provocations were planned by Kiev? There is no doubt. There can be no doubt, because every time, in order to lobby, to force through new weapon supplies, and first and foremost money, because everything is based on money in the Kiev regime and its relations with its Western masters, in order to lobby all those things and attract social and public attention to the matter, to convince the international community, to give the opportunity for media, Western media outlets, to organize the necessary events. Before, an artifact was needed, and now a performance is required. Horrifying, bloody performance, and most importantly, a dangerous one. But is there anything that can stop the Kiev regime from conducting such terrorist acts? They carry them out constantly, regularly. Can you recall how effectively was frustrated at a certain stage the visit of IAEA experts to the Zaporozhye nuclear station, and what for? In order to allow the Kiev regime to strike against this facility and use this topic in a practical dimension. This is something very obvious. We constantly draw the attention to these matters. We cite facts. We understand that, unfortunately, for now, the Kiev regime has the corresponding weapons and will continue to use the nuclear topic, nuclear stations, nuclear installations, as a tool to blackmail the international community. And precisely this should become a topic to be discussed at the Munich conference, taking into account that it deals first and foremost with European security. Thank you. And another question, if you allow, from another region. On the 7th of February in Tokyo, events were held dedicated to the so-called Day of Northern Territories, as they call the Kurils. How can you comment upon these events? I believe there is nothing new in what happened on the 7th of February. I believe that this is the event you are speaking about. Once again, we saw the same ritualistic, trite, and foolish acts of officials at the national meeting. Of course, there was a bus show. Those who have not seen it does not understand what I'm talking about. I have actually seen it. It is something resembling a horror movie when all trucks and buses painted in strange colors. There are megaphones and voice amplifiers attached, as well as little flags, and all this at a high volume level is transmitting constantly different slogans of nationalistic character.
Подгоняются все эти
They collect retro buses to the proximity of Russian diplomatic missions and use it as a tool of psychological pressure. From morning to the evening, they are broadcasting these things. I've seen it on myself. When I was on a visit to Tokyo, I could see this show firsthand. And you know, there is one thing that surprises me. Surprisingly, they can't limit the direction of the sound only to the direction of the diplomatic missions. The sound is spreading in the residential area, and not Russian diplomats, but residents of these areas are suffering. Members of the officers in the proximity of this territory and those living nearby who cannot leave or travel anywhere. Why don't these Japanese nationalists, on the one hand, allegedly take care for their country? Why don't they care for their citizens, on the other hand? So I can't understand why they don't care for their own residents. But apparently it is a sort of tradition. I not only assume, I know for sure that these campaigns have been paid for. Those people sitting in the buses and pressing the buttons, starting the information broadcasting from the megaphones, they receive money for it. And I've seen that a person who has definitely traveled from a different continent, judging by his appearance, was sitting in a bus. He simply earned money. It is obvious, but it's not the only thing that do. They also spam the post boxes of our diplomatic missions with petitions, with some territorial claims, and so on and so forth. For some reasons, they consider these things as a pressure exercised against our country, but in reality, it is an act of it is a barbaric action. In response, we can only once again remind the government of Japan of the need to recognize in full measure the outcomes of World War II, enshrined in particular in the UN Charter. According to these outcomes, the Kurila Islands are an integral part of our country. As for the so-called peace talks, the Russian principled position was laid out in the statement by the MFA of the 21st of March 2022. We see no prospects for a dialogue regarding a fundamental document which would lay a foundation for the lasting good neighborly relations in the context of our unfriendly policy pursued by Tokyo. These retro buses with megaphones are not going to intimidate us. Constructive cooperation with Japan will only be possible after it clearly abandons its hostile policy. I think it's clear. Thank you so much. Is RIA Novosti here with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We are here with you. We have 3 questions to you today. First question is regarding Moldova. How would you comment on this statement by Madam Sanjay that the authorities don't receive credentials from a new ambassador of Russia because of the disrespectful statements against the Republic of Moldova? How would you comment on it? Well, she seems to link the treatment of our ambassador to the statements from Moscow. But in this vein, probably we should treat the Moldovan ambassador in Russia according to the statements made in Moldova. Well, if she wants to see it happening, she should say it explicitly. We have to state that the ambassador and the embassy of Russia in Chisinau are facing a discriminating treatment on the part of Moldovan authorities. It is discrimination. It can't be justified by any disrespectful statements for a number of reasons. First, because Moldovan officials regularly publicly insult our country, and we only respond to them. We only respond. I would suggest Madam Sand an experiment. Let her have spent 2 weeks without insulting, without disseminating fake news against Russia. As a result, she won't hear any comment against her country. Well, in some way we have to explain what is truth and what is fake. Let her conduct such an experiment, and she will find out that this rhetoric is simply a response to the insulting and fake statements by Moldovan officials against our country. And she is the first one who makes such statements. Second, although we do hear outrageous, insulting statements against our country and against the historical truth. There have been so far no hindrances to the work and operation of the Moldovan ambassador and embassy in Moscow. Talking about parity, probably they should develop this logic. Let me remind you that the current ambassador of Moldova entered Moscow in 2022, and in just 3 weeks, he handed over his credentials to the ministry. The Russian ambassador arrived to Moldova in October 2024. And it's now been the 5th month that he hasn't the chance to hand over the credentials. Just to compare, the current ambassador of Moldova entered Moscow in March 2024, and the next day handed over the copies of credentials to the MFA, and the originals were presented to the president in September 2022. We hope the Moldovan authorities will demonstrate maturity and reconsider its treatment of Russian ambassador in accordance with the principle of diplomatic reciprocity. And question number 2. Yesterday, the Russian ambassador was summoned to the Moldovan MFA, allegedly because parts of Russian drones were discovered in Moldova. How would you explain us what happened in reality? We reject such allegations. They are groundless. Drones are used by the Russian armed forces against military targets and related infrastructure of Ukraine. There can be 2 explanations for the drones found in Moldova. Explanation number 1, they could have been collected on the contact line and simply thrown to the Moldova territory, so it might be a provocation by the Kiev regime. They don't even fear to attack nuclear facilities, so collecting parts of the drones and transporting them somewhere would not be a problem for them. Second possible explanation, fragments of the drones could fall down in Moldova as a result of indiscriminate use of Ukrainian air defense systems and radioelectronic fight systems against Russian drones that targeted military infrastructure of Ukraine. The Russian side respects the sovereignty of the Republic of Moldova and the security and safety of its citizens. It's something our ambassador tries to inform the public in Moldova about, and recently Moldova denied a visa to France denied a visa to Russian journalists. How is the situation evolving? Well, indeed, Russian journalists, and I'm talking particularly about a journalist by Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, faced unfriendly measures. More precisely, he was denied a working visa. Well, definitely we understand and we assume that such things might happen, since the state has the right either to grant or to deny a visa, but other states too have a similar right. Once no justification was provided why this journalist was denied a visa, although he never had done anything wrong to the country. He had never worked abroad before, but no justification was presented. And for many years, and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia has been talking about it for many years, that we continue to see discriminating treatment of our journalists. We might use the reciprocal measures. We haven't applied them to foreign journalists, but now we see that those steps have become unfriendly and not only systemic, but also blunt, since the Russian side offered the French authorities to settle the situation. I'm not going to go into details, but we did offer some possible solutions, all of which were rejected. After that, we applied reciprocal measures. We simply denied a visa to the next French journalist who claimed it. But unlike the French journalist who had never worked in France as a journalist, the French journalist from Le Monde had worked in Russia before, and he had the experience of working in Russia. And on no occasion did he face discrimination against him. He only faced reciprocal measures. We explained to him that it had nothing to do with him individually or with his work. And we repeatedly stressed that if the French side unblocks the issues related to the issuance of visas to the Russian journalist, we unblock the issuance of visa to the French journalist. Once again, we receive requests from French journalists on a regular basis. I'm talking about requests for short-term journalist visas and so on. So if authorities in France, together with their media, want to continue this disinformation campaign and to place the responsibility for their mistake on us, well, they'll have to live in their world detached from reality, and from time to time we'll inform them what's happening in reality. So once again, let's stress this. If the French authorities are going, as we've heard, to deteriorate the working conditions for Russian journalists, we'll respond in the same way, but it's not our method. We are not going to initiate such treatment of foreign journalists. What we did was only a reciprocal measure, only a response. Of course, we took note of the information campaign with publication of anti-fakes about Russian journalists. We see that Russian journalists are accused of various things, and the situation is presented in a fake format and in the wrong light. It is important, and I hope that some of French journalists might write about it. The French embassy in Russia denied a visit to the journalist of a Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, and even after that, the Russian side proposed its solutions to the situation. We sent several notes. We proposed mutually acceptable solutions. But when all proposals were rejected, these measures of response were taken. Thank you, Madam Zakharova. Thank you. We move on. Is Russia Today here with us? Yes, good afternoon. The new administration in Washington didn't lift sanctions against the NIS, a company that is owned by Gazprom. What is the current stage of negotiations on the petroleum industry of Serbia, or briefly NIS, in the light of the US sanctions and the expiry dates? And does Russia have red lines on this topic? Thank you. The problem with the US sanctions against NIS does exist. Negotiations are ongoing among the sectoral and respective bodies. That's all from my part. I have nothing to add so far. Thank you. Is Izvestia here with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions today. First, the Parliament of Armenia adopted in the first reading the draft law on accession to the European Union. How would you evaluate the prospects of Euro integration of the state, and did it impact the relations between Moscow and Yerevan in the context of the Eurasian Economic Union? I would like to emphasize something once again, although the MFA and the presidential office representatives have already spoken about it. It's not about political considerations. The thing is that all regulations and tariffs applied in the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union are different. So it's not possible to ignore the problem. It is nothing but to deny the reality itself and disinformation of those who are supposed to take the decision. It is the sovereign choice of Armenia, and in no way do we deny it. But it is the Armenian authorities and not Russia, not the Eurasian Economic Union, that bears the main responsibility for informing the population about all consequences of the steps they are planning. They have to understand it. And let me say that when a country or part of a country takes such fateful decisions, and since the Western experience is so dear to the heart of current Armenian authorities, they might conduct a poll or a referendum or conduct some preparatory work, including explanation of all the details related to this decision. They have to be honest. But once again, it should be done by those who are calling inside the country for such decisions and not someone from outside. So it's not a task of Russia or the Eurasian Economic Union to explain such things to the Armenian population. And my second point, not only should they explain the details about what's going to happen, but they should also speak about the experience of other states and draw specific examples of how it happened in the modern history, simply to provide the people with a full picture.
Thank you. And my second question, how could you comment upon such a sharp turnabout in opinion of the former president of Finland, Sinistio, towards Russia, in particular in the context of what he presented in his report in October 2024, entitled Safe Together, Strengthening Civil and Military Readiness of Europe, where he expressed radical assessments of the policies of our country, which allegedly poses an existential threat to the security of Europe. The very formulation of the question is laughable, because if the US president openly, publicly stated that had it not been for the previous president of the US, nothing would have happened in terms of the situation in Ukraine. Do they not hear all those things? Also, here we should recall all our reasoning in this regard about multi-hour interviews given by Russian president, explanations provided by all our agencies, ministries, experts, the etymology of crisis, and to talk about Russian aggression is something that can no longer be done. And another aspect, if such a radical, complete metamorphosis is taking place, such a complete turnabout in reverse, a U-turn in one's position of a concrete person, then this is the person that should be asked that question. When was he lying? Back when he was a president, or when he was no longer president? Because when he was president, he said different things. Now suddenly he has changed his opinion. If he lied when he was the president of Finland, then he should answer to the people of his country, whom apparently in that case he has been fooling. he should explain himself to the people. If right now he is saying those things and is lying right now, in that case as well, he should explain why he is doing that. To be frank, I believe that this is not a question that should be addressed to us. This is a question to him. Thank you. Do we have China Media Corporation with us? Yes. A lot of things have been said about it today. We have two questions. Last week, US President Donald Trump stated that he is interested in signing with Ukraine an agreement on receiving rare metals and other resources in exchange for weapons supplies. What do you think about that? I believe that everyone knows, and the current US president has never tried to conceal it, the fact that he treats everything in terms of business and benefit. This is his credo, and I believe that he is very consistent in this regard. He spoke about it during his electoral campaign and when he was implementing his duties. I believe that this is a commercial proposal. It is better to ask him about it, but I can comment upon the response of Zelensky. Zelensky instantly said that he promised to consider the project in an accelerated manner. It seemed that everything was about to be agreed upon, but for Zelensky, I would read Ukraine's constitution. There is an interesting article, Article 13 in the constitution. Perhaps this is an unlucky for this matter, an unlucky figure for this matter, but we cannot omit words from the text of the constitution. Ukraine's constitution, Article 13, quote, "The territory, the soil, the air, water, and other natural resources that are within Ukraine's territory, the natural resources of its continental platform, exclusive sea economic zone, are objects of the property of the Ukrainian people. On behalf of the Ukrainian people, property rights are being exercised by state authorities and local authorities within the defined by the Constitution. Every citizen has the right to use the natural objects of the property right of the people in accordance with the law. This property is binding, and the property should not be used to cause harm to people and society." Perhaps this formulation in the article, every citizen can use the natural resources. Perhaps, since there is no mention again of Ukraine, he believes that any citizen of any country can make use of those resources, since they have problems interpreting text sometimes. Once again, Zelensky is trying to destroy what he was not the one to create. Right now, we have to recall that this is the acting constitution of Ukraine. And another question about the Munich conference. On the eve of the event, a report was published, the Munich Report on Security 2025. It is dedicated to multipolarity. The report states that the tendency towards multipolarity in the world is an irrefutable fact. The Munich Security Index was also simultaneously published, which shows that people in the countries with emerging economy believe that the new multipolar world would be more just and peaceful, but at present some Western countries artificially divide the world into blocks, form small circles, erect small internal walls, and are trying to break contact, which leads to a further fragmentation of the world. What do you think about the possibilities and challenges related to world multipolarity? Let me cite an example. Only now, in some sentences, very vague, the authors of the report you mentioned for the Munich conference mention the creation and consolidation of a multipolar world, even though before they had been constantly talking about a rule-based world order and the world multipolarity, and expressions related to multipolarity were not used in political terminology. They were obsessed with the narratives that they received from Brussels. At the same time, Russia and China, when do you believe spoke for the first time about multipolar world? Somebody may say 5 years ago, others may say 10 years ago. Let's count together. Russia and China back in 1991 stated that the world was becoming multipolar. There is evidence. These were not simple formulations made by experts. This was a joint declaration which has a very similar title about the multipolar world and the consolidation of a new international order. How many years passed since 1997? 3 decades have passed. Our country's 2 nuclear powers, responsible members of the Security Council, have been living in accordance with the ideas pronounced publicly and followed the obvious tendencies related to multipolarity. And all our 2 powers have done was done in order to develop and follow up on the philosophy that they shared with the whole world. What were the experts at the Munich conference doing? They were speaking about the exclusivity of some, the hegemonism of others, about a rule-based world order of the third parties, though it was unclear whose rules and how they were created. They spoke about everything but not about multipolarity, because there was not even a platform that could be recalled nowadays where these topics would be discussed. This is the answer to the question who is honest and who is spreading fake news. There is evidence. In these 3 decades, considerably grew the number of states that share this point of view. This is how they see the paradigm of development in the 21st century. The first 15 years of the 21st century has already passed. The first quarter is over, almost, and the Munich Security Conference has yet to understand what is the vector of the planet's development this century. A quarter of a century before the eyes of the very same participants has already concluded, and they are just recalling this right now because they were denying reality. They did not want to see the facts. They were reviewing history. They were occupied with other things. They were trying to use these platforms to substitute international law with their rule of the strong. But it did not happen because this is an idea that has no scientific corroboration, and now urgently they are trying to draw up different reports on multipolarity, and what a horror for them. The new US president is saying that from one center of power they have no intention to rule over the planet and the rest of the universe as well. Because of these new words, now their narratives are being rewritten and reviewed, as well as their concepts, very urgently and quickly. 30 years they spent to invent what does not exist. Let us continue. The very same concept was consolidated as an official position of a number of international groups such as SCO, BRICS, with which NATO structures did not even want to have anything in common. They did everything in their power to minimize in other platforms for those groups to work in full force. Why? Because they were busy with the ultraliberal agenda, with the chimeras of ultraliberalism that, in their view, should penetrate every part of the world. The movement of the world towards multipolarity, and here we also need to say the following, is something that was repeatedly mentioned by Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, on the 79th session of the General Assembly of the UN. He spoke about it. Polycentric world order does not mean a fragmentation of the community. Multipolar world order is a common interconnected world where, without hegemony and many models of development, the space for opportunity is growing for mutually beneficial cooperation. And I also would like to add, for all participants, not for certain groups, but for everyone. In such a world, the implementation of bloc policies by certain countries is not leading to the isolation of those that they want to segregate, but rather to their self-isolation, to their own loss of opportunities, to their falling behind in development. But that is their sovereign right. If that is what they want to do, let them. A key question is how to organize international relations in multipolar epoch. Russia advocates for serious dialogue about adapting the current international architecture for it to better reflect new emerging multipolar realities and ensure just and sustainable development. And in this regard, it would be beneficial to study the statements made by President Putin in the Valdai Forum in 2023 and 2024. And of course, our countries, Russia and China, have a special role as two sovereign states and two civilizations with thousands of years of Indians like India, Iran, Brazil, Turkey, and other members of international community who have their own contribution and opinion about the consolidation of a multipolar world order. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have Reuters with us? If you allow me, I would like to ask you for clarification about your answer to a colleague from Международная жизнь about the Munich conference. You said that officials from Russia would not take part in the Munich conference. But perhaps the Russian delegation is in Munich to participate in negotiations with the American delegation announced by Donald Trump. Is that true? If you are talking about the Munich Security Conference, I have already answered. We have not received invitations to that conference, and without invitation, we cannot come to the conference. I have said nothing new. This is something that logically follows from the fact that we were not invited by the Munich conference. We cannot accept an invitation or deny it if there was no invitation. If you are speaking in general, whether there are people from Russia in Munich, well, then that's not a serious question. And it is impossible to answer. Are the Russian representatives in Germany? Of course, our embassy is there. What exactly is your question? I wanted to ask you to confirm or deny Trump's statements that today in Munich there will be negotiations between Russia and US on Ukraine settlement. In order to confirm or deny of US President's words, you should address, if you are in Moscow, US Embassy in Moscow. If you are not here, then official American institutes. This is the first thing. The second thing is the administration of the president repeatedly has stated that teams of negotiators, groups of negotiations is something that is being worked on, and relevant clarifications have already been given. I do not believe that I have to repeat this, but once again, I would like to emphasize this is the prerogative of the Russian president to make such decisions, and they will be conveyed to the public through the administration of the president, and if there is such an order, then also conveyed by the ministries who have the relevant jurisdiction. I would like to once again reiterate that you can look at the statements given by the administration of the president. They are exhaustive. I have all the quotes right here. I see how masterfully the same question is being asked every time, but the essence remains the same. This is the decision of the president, and once it is made, it will be conveyed to the public. Thank you. And another question, which we prepared for this briefing at the outset, negotiations regarding Russian servicemen in Syria. What is the stage they are at? What new terms are being made by the Syrian authorities, and if these terms are acceptable to Russia? We have repeatedly stated that we seek consistent active development of ties between Russia and Syria. In different fields, our contacts with Syria are meant to put into practice the opportunities that exist in bilateral cooperation at the current stage. Also, the parties are speaking about the matter of Russian military presence in Syria. At the current phase, we should abstain from public comments because this work is ongoing. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have Rudolf with us? If Rudolf TV channel is not with us, we will keep going. Do we have here Moscow Post? Yes, good morning. We had two questions, but we will no longer ask one of them because you have already in detail commented upon the Munich conference. What will be the reaction to the alleged capture of Russian ships in the Baltic region and attempts to legalize these acts of piracy?
Вы знаете,
Well, I think we've repeatedly discussed this topic. Our reaction to the seizure, yes, and the plans of legal assessment of these acts of piracy. Well, let's be more specific. If we're talking about Russian vessels or Russian citizens, then just as it was the case in the previous years, we will apply a set of regulations and norms dictated by our conceptual documents. If we're talking about Russian citizens, we will protect and defend the rights of our compatriots. It's not the first time in history we've been facing it. So I believe it is important to speak about each and every situation in particular, because in general our situation can't change. We do have specific and certain duties. If you have a specific question on a particular situation, we'll comment on it. Thank you. Let's move on. Is Rudolf probably already here with us? Well, if it's not the case, is Anadolu here with us? Yes, good afternoon. Anadolu is here. We have two questions today. First, what is the position of Russia regarding the negotiations between Israel and Hamas that have stalled? And what do you think of the threats by President Donald Trump against Hamas? As for our position, we've already outlined it, and I can't repeat what we said earlier. We believe that strict adherence to the agreements you've mentioned are a key to normalizing the situation in the Gaza Strip and in the area of Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general. At this stage, I wouldn't give any principled or detailed assessments of the outcome and the results of implementation of the first stage of arrangement, because it is to expire and to conclude by the 2nd of March. As for the time being, there have been mutual accusations, there have been problems and hindrances, but none of the parties has abandoned it. In Doha, new indirect contacts between the delegations of Hamas and Israel took place. Probably they can be considered as continuation of the negotiating process. We hope there will be lasting negotiations and there will be a lasting ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and the way will be paved to the settlement of the Palestine problem. Based on these assessments, that's what I can say as response to your question. And question number 2, Moscow repeatedly voiced concerns regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza. What's your assessment of the current humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip, and what steps are you taking to settle the humanitarian crisis? Is Russia planning, has it already provided some assistance to the Gaza and in the restoration of the territory, and if yes, in what form? We've always said that the situation in Gaza is an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in terms of its scale and impact. The number of those in Israel killed, wounded, or missing in Gaza has already exceeded 160,000 people. Over 1.9 million people have been internally displaced, over 19% of the population. As a result of hostilities, civilian infrastructure has been almost completely destroyed. According to expert estimates, most of the territory will not be suitable for living there. I'm sure you know about these assessments. Despite the ceasefire agreement, there are hindrances for the supply of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. As a result, those who stayed there are suffering from malnutrition and lack of elementary medical services and routine assistance, and a spread of dangerous diseases. Russia was among those countries who promptly responded to the situation. Since October 2023, we provided over 800 tons of cargo through the Egyptian Society of Red Crescent. We provide humanitarian assistance to those Palestinians in need, and many Russian NGOs and civil organizations were involved, as well as some private persons. We will continue this work. Thank you so much. Let's move on. Is News.ru here? News.ru. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. My first question is as follows. Back to the topic of the Munich conference. On the eve of the opening of this conference, the organizers recognized that the world is now a multipolar world order, but they invented a new term. They are speaking about multipolarized world. Why do you think are they using this new word? Why don't they use the normal word, the multipolar world order? When looking at Boris Johnson, we get think that the world may become electricized. If they only judge by themselves, if they only talk to their reflection in the mirror. And I think they don't even look into the mirror any longer. They have long replaced the mirrors with their parade pictures, and they are satisfied with this dialogue. They don't see what's happening outside their windows. They don't see their own reflection. They don't understand what they look like. And they are no longer capable of accepting criticism or even reality. Yes, once again, I'll give this example. If these people had been talking for years about some new normal or multi-genders, how can they possibly give right assessments of less obvious things? They were who blocked themselves from the inside to prevent the inflow of fresh air in the form of normal reality, true reality. They are under the influence of their own conclusions, and they are never fed in by the new facts. Well, you understand, they do exist in their bubble. Now, when from the inside, after their big brother voiced the idea that the world cannot be governed or managed from one center, when this idea was mentioned from the inside, they had to invent some new notions. And they started playing with words and inventing some new expressions. Apart from other things, they can't accept it that it was back in 1997 when Russia and China adopted a joint declaration. And Western participants of the Munich conference never paid it any attention. For 30 years, for almost three decades, did they ignore it? Which means that taxpayers who pay for their policy simply send their leaders to the conference in vain. Was it all in vain? Was it an empty talk? So now they are playing with words and invent some new notions and ideas. But you can start dealing with the problem once you accept the problem exists. I believe they are only approaching the stage of recognition that they were wrong. We don't feel any sarcasm, or rather for them it is a necessity. We are sharing the same continent, and many of the things that we have and share today have a joint history and joint future. But above all, it's their problem. They have to recognize it. But neither should they forget about the problems they had created for the world. Thank you. Question number 2. You mentioned that the armed forces of Ukraine shelled a convoy with experts of IAEA and disrupted the rotation at the Zaporozhye NPP. What was the goal? Because Kiev keeps stressing that it successfully cooperates with the IAEA. Well, I believe the goal was to intensify the activities by the Munich conference, or probably even take some critical steps with regards to the Zaporozhye NPP. Therefore, they didn't need members of the IAEA on the site, on the ground, because a dramatic development would have led to the need to report officially to the Director General of the IAEA. The Kiev regime would have to explain something, therefore they didn't want the IAEA experts to be there. So it's very probable that they were preparing something by the Munich conference. I have no doubts they were planning something by the Munich conference. And I can tell you more. We did have such evidence and such information. But they implemented these plans with regards to the Chernobyl NPP. Let me remind you what happened. This night, there were reports about a provocation against the Chernobyl NPP It is yet another, and I'm afraid not the last step by the Banderovites aimed at undermining the nuclear security. I'll remind you that such provocations existed before. There were attacks on the 11th of August last year against the cool tower of the Zaporozhye NPP. It was there was a recognized killing on the 4th of October 2020 against a security officer of the NPP. They undermined the rotation of the experts in December and in February, and there was an artillery shelling of a distribution station of the Zaporozhye on the 13th of February. All of these events cannot be accidental. Nuclear facilities are considered by the Kiev regime as the targets for nuclear terrorism. Provocations at the Chernobyl NPP are an obvious continuation of these criminal activities by the Kiev regime. It knows full well what it's doing. Back in the time, Russia was engaged in the efforts to construct this facility in order to mitigate the consequences of the Chernobyl accident. And the current efforts of the armed forces of Ukraine undermine the efforts, the long-year efforts, multinational efforts. They involved not only our country, and for many years did we take steps to care for the safety of this facility. So it is nothing but provocation. Earlier, we repeatedly warned of such provocations. Then we stated that they had been implemented, and once again, our warnings were not in vain. And I believe it is another lesson for those who try to take care of the Kiev regime. It is another lesson for them. The nuclear technologies in the hands of the criminal Zelensky regime are a threat to international nuclear security and safety. Even NPPs are considered by the Zelensky regime as a tool in their terrorist activities. As for their desire to possess nuclear weapons, don't have to say what they are going to use it once should they have it, they would apply it immediately. And let me add something. The situation with the IAEA experts. We regularly comment on these situations. On the 12th of February, there was an elaborate comment on this topic, and now I reiterated only some fragments of this statement. And my last question is about our partners from across the ocean. Pete Haxis really stated that return to the borders of 1991 is not possible for Ukraine. Haxis said it during the meeting in the Ramstein format. Do you believe that the new leadership of the U.S. starts to evaluate the balance of power in the Ukraine conflict in a realistic manner? Well, I'll reiterate what the Russian leadership has already mentioned on multiple occasions. The Biden administration has left leftovers to the Western allies. The West has to pay the bill and to clean the restovers of the Washington policy. It was part of the strategy to place the entire burden on the West first to defeat a strategic defeat in the EU in the first place. Their currency, their economy was developing far too successfully. So they used illegitimate sanctions, and the steps taken by the Biden administration, they simply destroy their Western partners. But as a next step, they wanted to make sure that with the already terrible situation in the industry, economy, and security, the EU takes over the responsibility for what's happening in Ukraine. First, I'm talking about the funding of the Kiev regime, and second, restoration of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. It is also part and parcel of this strategy. So it's no surprise that they are implementing this policy in reality, in practice. We should take note of the statements by President Trump that he's not inspired by this policy. It was invented by the previous administration, and he would have never taken such steps. It's something he tries to persuade others of. So the question is different. When will EU countries awake? Some of them are trying to come to their senses right now, and some kept awake 3 other crisis times, and some countries continue to believe that it is possible to change the gender. Thank you, Madam Zakharova. Thank you.
Once again, Rudolph. Has it connected? In that case, News Front. Yes. International Agency News Front, Bulgaria. Allow me, Madame Zakharova, about the possible negotiations to settle the Ukrainian conflict. From the beginning of the special military operation in many European countries, including Bulgaria, where I live, people were demanding the government to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. In Europe, they call it military aid. Many media outlets were glossing over such events, trying to pretend that they did not exist. As we have seen with what happened with the USAID, and now we see the possibility for negotiations on Ukraine. Can the demand to stop funding of weapons to the regions held by illegitimate authorities to be one of the terms presented by Russia, and can it be in one way or another legalized? Because it is not logical to send weapons and talk about peace. We have been talking about this for many years, and you ask whether it will be a condition. Yes, we say that supplies of weapons have to be stopped, that the continuation of the conflict is related to the continuation of weapon supplies. To speak about a concrete negotiations matter is too premature, and I believe that you are not right in correlating different topics for the future, one of which is contained in our political, diplomatic, mediatic appeal. This is something we have spoken about for years. We have explained that weapon supplies, it is something illegal. It goes against the ideas and aspirations for peace that we hear. These weapon supplies is the reason for the continuation of bloodshed. This is something that I say at every briefing. I speak about the violation of contract obligations if we speak of third parties that resell weapons. we expose and speak about it for many years. Perhaps it has been a long time since you have visited us, and perhaps you have not been following this aspect. You should not believe that this topic is something new. It has been on the agenda for many years. It's not about it emerging, but whether Russia will put it forward as a condition to start such negotiations. A very simple matter: stop weapon supplies and sit at the negotiations table to incentivize the process. Up until recently, there was nothing to foster because one party has prohibited negotiations and the other party said that only at the battleground it could be solved. So your question is a little bit misaimed. What can we foster here? We have defined our goals. The conceptual attitude towards settlement was voiced by President of Russia in 2024 in the MFA, precisely here in this very room. So our position is clearly defined. What the other side will do, that is the question better addressed to them. Our positions are already defined when it comes to the objectives of the special military operation and matters related to the settlement. If you say that we should add another component to this, the fundamental approaches already exist. How hypothetically in the future will that all be put on paper, we will comment upon when it comes time. Thank you. Do we have Lantaru with us? Yes, good morning. I have the following question. On the 2nd of February, Mr. Peskov said that Kremlin had no information about a meeting between Putin and the special U.S. envoy. Could you tell us if Woodkov met with Sergei Lavrov or other representatives of the MFA? We would have informed you about it. I can say that I have no information about meetings in the MFA. Thank you. I have a second question. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth stated that the U.S. did not consider Ukraine's membership in NATO as a condition for negotiations on settlement. Does Moscow believe that this is a concession on the part of the U.S., and is Russia prepared to make some kind of a concession in turn? Whose concession? Will Washington make any concessions? I believe this is about them being realistic. You have heard about, apart from the statement from the Pentagon head, you might have heard President Trump's statement. He believes that the whole story began after Biden's team had started to speculate on the topic of NATO, on including Ukraine in NATO. He elaborated that thought. I believe that this speaks to his realism, and the realistic approach should not be underestimated. It is a key element for moving forward. We have spoken quite a lot about that. And we have always said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is unacceptable to Russia. It poses a serious threat to Russian security, and it will bring about catastrophic consequences for Europe. We should note that our understanding of how it should look was presented as well by President Putin in June 2024. Naturally, we require guarantees. Words are not enough. Politically announced opinions are not enough. We need guarantees. Otherwise, the problem will keep bringing about further problems and issues for the European continent and, as we can see, for the whole continent in general. But I believe that the statements that we hear from Washington speak to a realistic approach when they deal with the situation. Thank you. Do we have here the Big Asia? Yes. Good afternoon. We have a follow-up question to the Gaza Strip matter. Ex-Prime Minister Turkey Davutoglu proposed to give the Gaza Strip the status of a Turkish autonomy. He criticized Trump's plans, who earlier stated that the U.S. would take the Gaza Strip under control and would be responsible for its restoration. In particular, Davutoglu said that Turkey, as the legal successor of the Ottoman Empire, should treat the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip as their comrades and let the Gaza Strip hold a referendum and join Turkey as an autonomous region until a Palestine state is created. It is up to the residents of the Gaza now. How can you comment upon this news? I would first and foremost like to say that we comment upon officials' statements that have the necessary authority to make statements on behalf of states. Political figures that do not hold the relevant offices and do not have the relevant authorities are aplenty, especially when it comes to hot topics. These people sometimes change their views and statements, and we believe that it is not necessary to comment upon them. Sometimes we do take note of them, we do register them, but I believe that it would not be appropriate to comment upon statements because we are not talking about a state's position. First and foremost, I believe that the Palestinians should be asked what it is they want, and I believe they want their own state, and they have repeatedly said that. It is also consolidated and enshrined in relevant international documents. This should be first and foremost taken into account when somebody starts to predict the future of the Palestinians and the region as a whole. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have Al-Maidin here? Do we have Iceland Radio? Yes, good morning. I would like to ask about the Middle East, but Anadolu and Big Asia have already asked. Then I am putting my stakes on the other question. I would like to ask about Russian MFA's opinion of Donald Trump's statement regarding the conversion of the Gaza Strip into a certain Riviera on the ruins of the Gaza, as well as his ultimatum to Hamas on Saturday to rain hell if the hostages are not released. Perhaps the Palestinians should address humanitarian organizations on human rights, the UN, the ICC, and so on and so forth. Perhaps you should ask that the Palestinians, when it comes to plans about recreating, I don't even know what verb to use. If we consider that the Gaza Strip is really in ruins, here restoration is not quite the apt word to use. Let us say that plans regarding the future of the Gaza Strip, these plans should correspond to the wishes of the residents of that region, of that area, and they should also correspond to the international legal decisions that have already been adopted and have not been cancelled. If you have no further questions. Yes, I only have. Do you believe that it would be beneficial to invite Donald Trump for the celebration of the victory in the Great Patriotic War? Questions related to contacts or events at the highest level are commented upon by the administration of the Russian president. This is the golden rule that we have. I once again remind it to you. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have Verelk here? Good afternoon. I have a few questions. You have answered the first, but I would like to ask for a clarification when it comes to the bill adopted by the Armenian parliament regarding Armenia's integration in the EU. Right now, there is debate in the country. The opposition believes that it will affect relations, economic relations with Russia, will provoke a loss of its market. The officials believe that it would not affect Armenia, and Armenia would only sign the trade treaty. You said that it was impossible to combine both relations with Russia and its membership in the EU. Right now, I would like to ask for clarification. What do you mean when you say that the process will come to a conclusion? You mean it entering the EU? Arman Yegoryan clearly stated that we would exit the EU as soon as we signed the free trade agreement. So we would like to understand whether Moscow agrees with Armenia that while Armenia is not part of the EU, it would not affect its economic relations with Russia, or perhaps it could have a reflection in this field. Forgive me, you are an adult. Why do you ask such questions, clearly understanding the processes that are happening? What for? To hear from us the very same thing that you can write yourself. Perhaps you should honestly write and appeal to people who are dear to you. See the truth as it is, understand where you're being led, but that is not my job, that is yours. You want to draw attention, I believe. You care very much for Armenia, which is clear and understandable, but I believe that you should do it in a different way rather than come to a briefing and trying to attract attention in such a way to the problem. You are representative of this country, of its people. You can prepare the relevant materials as you see them. What would be the consequences and what could be the risks? That is not something that I could write in your stat. We have many times spoken about it. We have cited modern historical examples, and there is no reason to once again repeat it. If there were no means to spread information, or the regions were very remote where people have no access to information, perhaps then we would need to repeat it every day. But everyone already understands everything, so there is no need to repeat it once again. Once comes a time that you have to show your civil maturity and be closer to reality. That is all. You simply need to understand who, when in modern times, managed to reach a new level of development after such promises from the EU. Serbia for many years have been trying to correspond to European standards, but it has led nowhere, even though there were great many promises made to it, much more than others. who was successful in these attempts? Ukraine was promised things. Ukraine is so supported politically that it cannot even get close to the promised things. Instead, it is on the brink of a catastrophe. Can we find other examples of countries whose situation improves? I'm not even speaking about simple membership or associate memberships. There were many countries that made sacrifices in the fields of their economy to the European Union. I'm not even speaking of them. I'm speaking of those who are first being baited and then being lied to and fooled. There are many countries that the EU has promised many things over the years. What are you expecting to hear from me? You seem to want me to use different formulations in order to say that 2 + 2 = 4. You want me to say that 6 - 4 = 2. Okay, I can do that. 6 - 4 means 2. But the essence remains the same. When you perceive the information about EU's promises and assurances, one needs to understand what lies beneath and not believe in words, but rather in actions, and in practice learn from others' experience, remember one's own history, and from that premise draw conclusions. Not wait for some document to be signed. All these are words, but there is practice. I wanted to clarify my position. I was speaking about the debate in Parliament and during official statements. All emphasized that negotiations in Moscow were very productive. And on the one hand, the society hears that there would be problems with Russia in the actuality, with unclear prospects in the EU. On the other side, we hear that there would be no problems with Russia. And they say that once Armenia is part of the EU, it will sign a free trade agreement. People in Armenia want to understand what is your approach. Do you agree with the authorities or with the opposition? I believe it logical to assume that if we hear statements regarding the fact that the EAU is no longer something that official Yerevan is interested in, then that is not a question of state policy, but rather economic operators who draw relevant conclusions. They understand that it seems that their Armenian partners are not interested in cooperation, and development prospects are quite clear. This is something very trite and obvious.
Well, imagine, trade and economic relations are ongoing, and one of the partners says, "Be informed, I'm about to leave you." In that case, no one's going to take him into account and into consideration. It is not something that should be voiced from political tribunals. Just business people make some conclusions that they will no longer be considered partners, so they have to reorient themselves to different partners and different markets, and they will plan the activities accordingly. It's quite simple. Thank you. I thank you. And my second, let me give you an example. For example, well, we can talk about Russian companies, but it's not only about Russia. It also concerns the countries, other countries who are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. These companies here, the products that they imported from the Armenian partners will no longer be available for those choices and under those terms. More than that, they understand that after an alignment is established between Armenia and the EU, then automatically sanctions will follow. So they understand that that sort of the product that they received from Armenia will no longer be available, so they immediately will start looking for other partners and orient themselves to different countries and different producers. Probably 10 or 15 years earlier, people would say, we'll think about it when it happens. And now everyone knows what sanctions are, what secondary sanctions are, or indirect sanctions. And everyone understands that it is something that has to be calculated well in advance. Everyone understands this factor is important, and that joining the EU in any way will be associated with the need to impose sanctions against Russian economic operators. Everyone can calculate it in advance. Even today and previously, we stressed that it's not a political assessment. Those are economic realities. Deals are planned for some time in the future. People try to calculate their expenditure, the costs. So you'd better ask those who are the counterpartners or co-founders or trade partners of Armenian colleagues. You'd better ask them, what will you do if? And they will give you specific examples and explanations. What surprises me, what strikes me is that such simple things require some additional comments and explanations. Unfortunately, they do, in my view. In my view, unfortunately, they do. Many people don't understand such things. And my second... Let me add something. I believe that all experiments of this sort should imply certain guarantees. What sort of guarantees are provided? There have already been experiments around some other countries and political figures. They've already tried such experiments. But what are the guarantees? That's the question. My second question. The ambassador of Iran in Armenia said at a press conference that Armenia is the only country in the region that shares that Iran is the only country in the region that shares the position of Armenia regarding the so-called Zanzibar corridor. But in the trilateral talks between Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, an Zanzibar corridor was never discussed. You kept mentioning that the sovereignty of every country over the communications has to be preserved. So what's the difference in the views between Russia and Iran to unblocking the communications in the regions are? How would you comment on this and other statements by the ambassador of Iran that were related to Russia? As for the unblocking of transport communications in South Caucasus, the Russian and Federation and Iran have similar approaches, and it is enshrined in the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership signed on the 17th of January 2025 between our countries. According to this document, countries will facilitate strengthening peace and security in neighboring countries, including in the South Caucasus, and cooperate in order to prevent interference and destabilizing presence of third countries in the region. We believe that the fact that this understanding is reflected in the fundamental intergovernmental document signed for 20 years speaks volumes. Russia. The only difference is that Russia is a member of the Trilateral Working Group, co-chaired by Vice Prime Ministers of Russia, Azerbaijan and Armenia to unblock transport and economic ties in the South Caucasus. The working group has accomplished great work in terms of technical parameters for unblocking transport routes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Trilateral group reached basic arrangements about the basic principle for unblocking the communications. It is founded on the sovereignty and jurisdiction of states for the routes going through the territories of respective countries. Everyone knows that this understanding was recognized by Baku and Yerevan. Unfortunately, I have to state it. Due to the position of the Armenian side was frozen, but we are ready to resume full-fledged cooperation in the Trilateral Group. And my final question. A short time ago, near the borders of Armenia, large military exercises between the armed forces of Turkey, Azerbaijan and the US and other countries were held in Kosovo. What it is, it basically speaks of the fact that NATO is penetrating the region of the South Caucasus by means of military cooperation with the NATO member countries, Turkey and Azerbaijan. I'll consult my colleagues and provide you a written answer. Is the Vestnik of Kavkaz here with us? Yes. In the context of negative reports and opinions in the media and social networks regarding Russia-Azerbaijani ties, we would like to hear the official position of the Russian state. What is the current status of our relations with Azerbaijan, and how do you see the prospect of cooperation? Russia and Azerbaijan have a long-standing history of cooperation, and this is reflected in the respective documents. Since we have a history of relations and a valid legal framework for our relations, it is those two factors that determine the future of our relations. While anything might happen in the relations, that's what we are going through right now. We are going through the process, and we are concerned by this fact because we know what concerns the official Baku. We do understand that the tragedy that occurred and the claimed lives of citizens of Azerbaijan and our countries is very painful for both of our countries. We understand it's not happening in the vacuum, that there are many actors who want to benefit from it. We understand that there are attempts to drive wedges between the peoples in the countries who have such a long history and who share such a great responsibility in the region and who have such vast prospects for cooperation. But these attempts are doomed to fail. Our countries, Russia and Azerbaijan, have partnership and ally relations. That's how they always were defined. That's the nature of our relations. That's how we should consider them. In this context, it is very unfortunate that an information campaign was launched in the media space, in the information space. It is apparent that it is instigated by someone. And it is equally obvious that there are those who want to profit from the tragedy. I'm sure these attempts are doomed to fail. We have such a high level of relations that it is very unlikely that they will be replaced by different nature of relations. The level of our cooperation the death of our copyright and the wisdom of our peoples will help us overcome this challenge too. I come across some fakes. As for the situation around the Russian house in Baku, it is something to which we respond with our anti-fake reports. There are also direct attempts to say that allegedly Azerbaijan has no humanitarian cooperation with Russia. I'm not going to speak about shared history, about a large number of people-to-people projects in various fields such as arts, culture. But I would like to remind those who publish those lies that there is an Azerbaijani cultural center under the foreign language library in Moscow and the Gaidar Aliyev Foundation. There is an Azerbaijan pavilion in the Vedian territory. I regularly visit the Cultural Center of Azerbaijan as well as the Azerbaijan Pavilion. It is a very beautiful facility and something that is a symbol of our history. A short time ago, the Tourism Bureau of Azerbaijan was opened in our country. Many Azerbaijani natural cultural autonomies are represented in our country. They are around 100. There is an intensive diplomatic presence of our country in Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan diplomatic presence in Russia. They have consulates general in St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg. So all those who write that Russia is Azerbaijan only have one Russian house in Baku in common. It is simply due to the ignorance of the authors of such reports. Well, you know, as a rule, the more intense the history in the relations between two countries are, the more painful some problem issues are. And we are ready to resolve such problems in a constructive manner. That's what we not only responded publicly. The work is ongoing between our diplomatic missions and our consulates. Our diplomats are working together. So I simply reiterate once again, answering your question. Thank you. Is Alma Yedin here with us? Doesn't seem to be the case. Bolt News. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. I would like to specify the question of my colleague regarding the increased presence of the NATO in the Baltic Sea. Does the Russian MFA work in order to respond to the seizures of vessels and talks about the expansion of territorial waters of Finland and Estonia, accusations of Russia of damaging the underwater infrastructure and so on? When answering to the question of your colleague, I already gave an answer. You know, you are asking a very broad question. Is Moscow working to respond to something? Yes, so when haven't we responded to something? I told your colleague we should discuss very specific issues. We do have general information. We have already made it public, and we have already voiced it. I can send you these volumes of information. As for any specific case, any particular case, there will be a reaction. So if you have a more substantive, more detailed or specific question regarding a particular situation, I'll be more than glad to give an answer. Thank you. I see your point, Madam Zakharova. Is after E here with us? Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you for working on this topic on behalf of the veterans of the Baltic states. So we hope for the favorable outcome of the situation. We have 3 questions today. In your view, what does it mean for Russia that the U.S. President Trump has imposed the sanctions against the International Criminal Court in The Hague? Let me start by saying that Russia is not a member of is not a signature state of the Rome Statute. It's not because it is not in our interest, although it is an important factor. But there is something that is more important. We don't recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court because we believe that it is a pseudo-international body and a pseudo-legal and pseudo-court. We had a similar position some time ago, but it was not so tested in reality. Although there were individual cases and we had conducted analytical research, and those were theoretical assumptions. But now the entire world has seen the problems of this body. It is just one big problem. It was a quasi-court. It is functioning as a structure where everyone is doing whatever he or she wants. There is no clear or legitimate basis for its operation. A country can join or withdraw from the court. A state may say that it recognizes one judge but doesn't recognize the institution on the whole. A week later, another state states it recognizes the rulings against others but doesn't recognize the rulings against oneself. We've seen such a great number of facts that it's no longer interesting to comment on individual topics. Some years ago, when there were quasi-claims, unsubstantiated claims, claims that were of no interest for us.
We back then were citing examples to show how obvious and strange are the actions of this entity, and now everyone understands. It resembles an orchestra where everyone has its own sheet of notes, and everyone plays what he wants, how he wants, and the director is constantly changing. In this artistic way, I could answer your question. I could also send our more detailed assessment, and we will additionally publish it. But to be frank, this is an entity in regards to which, on a daily basis, controversial decisions are being made in different corners of the world. The very participants of this court, of these tribunals, even them, are contradictory in what they believe the institution is supposed to do. Thank you. Another question. In the EU, seriously, plans are being discussed to seize vessels allegedly tied to Russia in the Baltic region, the so-called Shadow Fleet. Essentially, we are talking about the preparation of a legalization of piracy. Our question is as follows: what would Russia's response should such piracy start, and can we believe that this is a provocation of a war against Russia and NATO countries? Once again, I reiterate that any attempts to interfere with the established order of navigation, the freedom of navigation of our vessels under imaginary pretexts will lead to no good. And it is quite obviously an open provocation. In this regard, I would like to recall that in January, NATO launched a special mission which they called the Baltic Guardian. Why did they do it? They did it not to maintain security in these waters, as they wanted it to be viewed, but rather to contain Russia in the region, to make navigation with Russia more difficult. We believe that NATO groups strengthening in the region will bring about an increase in the number of unintended incidents, and the aspiration to put under control transport flows will seriously affect international economic ties. There is nothing new, nothing changes. Everywhere NATO flag appears, we should expect a growth in confrontation and tensions, possible actions in relation to the seizure of Russian vessels from the juridical point of view, in particular in the context of the UN Convention on Sea Law from 1982, cannot be interpreted as acts of piracy, but rather will be a violation of the norms of international sea law in relation to the freedom of navigation. The detention of foreign ships, their inspections and detentions outside territorial seas can only be done based on limited grounds. Interference into the navigation of a ship for other reasons is illegal. This is why I would like to reiterate that these general comments have already been given, and then we will just give our views on the situation as it is in different regions, including the Baltic region, and respond depending on the circumstances, because every situation is different, as are the details. Thank you. And in conclusion, in your opinion, since we lost our positions in Syria, do you believe military technical assistance to African countries could get weaker, and which steps are in the works in order to prevent our cooperation with Africa from weakening and disappearing? I cannot agree with your view that we lost political positions in Syria. First and foremost, we need to understand that a loss or strengthening of positions in a state is not an apt or correct statement, because there is a number of reasons. Someone can be accused of interfering into internal affairs, invent something else, such as international law violation accusations. Here we have to speak about the history of relations and the prospects that exist. There was a recent phone conversation at the highest level which confirmed the interest from both sides to elaborate a wide agenda to develop bilateral ties. When it comes to the weakening of cooperation with African partners, I believe there is no such trend. We have just recently presented a second African department in the MFA, and I've seen a reaction close to panic in some states. Russian-African cooperation is coming to a new quality level, and a powerful impetus for that was the first and second Russia-Africa summits that were held in such a format. And in November 2024, there was the first ministerial conference. We actively worked to put into practice is the agreements we reached based on the plan of actions of the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum for 2023-2026. I believe that there are a lot of examples. We open embassies in some countries on the African continent. In other places, we reopen embassies because for a while they were not working. Now, when it comes to the military technical field, we provide assistance for strengthening the security and defense readiness of African states. This is something that we also convey to you regularly, and thus I do not agree with the premises of your question. Thank you. Who is left? We have the Russian vector, the Russian strategic vector. Good afternoon. I'm listening. We have two questions. The first is as follows. Vyacheslav Volodin the other day stated that Russia should request the U.S. Congress a list of Russians who received residents of Russia who received financing from the USAID in order to pass over these lists to the FSB. What is your opinion? We every day see a number of documents published by the U.S. Also, I believe that the destructive acts of the USAID have prepared a favorable ground for such occurrences. And the amount of money and the number of people and institutes involved and fed by this poisonous source are very large. And it would be interesting to me to learn more details. And this is something that we'll speak about very frequently from now on, for a very simple reason. In 2012, Russia made the corresponding steps to expel this institution from our country. Instead of a silent acceptance, understanding our position, Washington, through a tantrum, they accused us, they harassed us, they threatened us with many different retaliatory measures. But we were in the right, and now the US even admits it. And now, since we remember these hysterics, Hillary Clinton's constant words and the words of her advisors, taking all this into account, we will take seriously this matter. We will follow the development of the situation. I believe that such lists, as you spoke about, would be very beneficial. A second question. Putin, in his phone conversation with Trump, once again emphasized the need to eliminate the root causes of the conflict. Lavrov, in his video congratulations, said that the priority and sacred duty is to defend the world based on the results of World War II. What root causes of the Ukrainian conflict are meant? The legal status of Ukraine from the moment of its illegal exit from the USSR? Please, just a second, so that I do not have to retell this. I am ready to provide you with a number of links, and we will also publish them in the text version of the briefing. In these materials, the foreign minister, the president of our country, spoke in detail about these aspects. Persecution of Russians, elimination of the Russian language, rewriting of history, disrespect towards the cultural identity of the people who believe themselves Russians and lived in the territory or used to live in the territory of Ukraine. The neo-Nazi underlayer that emerged there and consolidated over the years, these and other things were commented upon, and they are contained in the materials, the links to which I will provide you with, and they will also be included in the text version of the briefing. Thank you. Do you have Голос Отечества? Thank you. We have 3 questions. What do Western values defenders expect when they say that Trump will change his attitude towards Ukraine and will stop considering Russia an enemy? Is such a development possible if in U.S. doctrinal documents Russia is presented as enemy number 1? Can you repeat that? It is a bit confusing. Yes, once again. I will slow down. It's not a matter of speed. What is your question? Can you be more concrete? We have the defenders of Western values, and they say, now it is clear who has defenders of Western values in Russia. And they say that now that Trump has come to power, he will change his attitude towards Ukraine and stop considering Russia as an enemy. We will become U.S. friends, they say, even though in the doctrine of the U.S., Russia is presented as enemy number 1. It can be assessed in different ways, but the essence is the same. We are presented as opponents. There are different documents, NATO documents, US documents. It is all the same. Publicly and privately for many years they have been saying that first they would contain us, and then they proclaimed that they would try to inflict us with a strategic defeat. That was spoken publicly, and I want to say that this is a question that has very long roots. I do not even know where to start. In the US, there is such a plenty of problems, which is something that they now admit openly, that first they should manage to deal with those problems. I believe that the main enemy of the US is their own problems, that now they are starting to clean as dirty linen. It is impossible to unsee, and it is impossible to tolerate the skeletons that they find in their own closets. This is from a theoretical point of view. Second aspect, we have seen different periods. We remember the times when in the US doctrines it was put down that cooperation with Russia was possible, but in reality the attitude was different. NATO was expanding. Discriminatory restrictions on trade were not cancelled. Do you remember? During negotiations, they said that we had a great future, but they did not cancel those restrictions. Do you remember when Jackson Vanek's amendment was adopted, stating that the USSR did not allow Jews to exit the territory of the country? Many even returned, and the amendment was not cancelled. At a moment when everything was ready, and we only were stumbling upon these amendments, and we even agreed upon cancelling the amendment. Instead of cancelling it and forgetting it, it was exchanged for the law of Magnitsky. It was only a matter of a month. Almost instantly, this law was adopted to substitute the previous one, and it contained sanctions, other measures, sanction lists. Sometimes the written words contradict the reality. Third aspect, we need to treat American leadership as the leadership of another country with its own national interests, with its own political difficulties, and we have to put our stakes on our own development and our own national interests. if we see reasonable reactions, if we see realistic approaches and desire to cooperate, we are ready and willing to do it. If we see another approach, then we also treat it realistically. I would like to add to my answer. Yes, please do. Communists in the US have always been considered enemies, and as far as I know, they have not changed their legislation, and they are still considered enemies. So the US do not change their policies if it's said that Russia is an enemy and legally consolidated, then it is so, because the US law is above other things. We don't have enemies in Russia. Well, there is no enemies in Russia. There was that an addition to my answer or my question or your question. What I'm trying to say is that the U.S. doesn't seem to show any tendency to change. There was an obvious change in rhetorics. We need to hear the obvious. You cannot refuse that there was a change in rhetorics. There is a change in the assessment by Washington of what is happening in the world. They openly spoke about it and mentioned documents. They said that the previous administration had been interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. They openly showed how much it had cost. They said that the situation in Ukraine was provoked by Joe Biden. They said that they had no intention to claim unicentric rule and hegemony. In rhetorics, we can see this change. It is a question of whether it will be translated to reality. How does the MFA evaluate the fact that the U.S. administration uses a Nazi welcoming gesture in a live broadcast? You probably are talking about a statement that he has made. Why should the MFA respond to that? Was it similar to the Nazi salute? First and foremost, you have to ask that party what that was all about. It was, I don't remember, representative of the administration. You have to ask him what was that. I do not intend to engage in guesswork and try to make up answers. It's not something that I want to do. We have enough Nazi manifestations in Ukraine with a large history. Manifestations in NATO countries are enough against the backdrop of support to Kiev and the real reincarnation of the neo-Nazism.
It is enough that the U.S. themselves don't support the UN General Assembly resolution and vote against the condemnation of neo-Nazism. And you are asking me what happened there on the TV. We see a broader picture. Not on a single occasion did they consolidate themselves with the obvious approach that there should be no glorification of Nazism. That's the problem. And not that someone did something. So ask him about it, then we'll be able to give our assessment. But if an entire country doesn't consider it possible to say no to the new manifestations of racism, xenophobia and neo-Nazism, as a country they don't want to do so, and you are asking about me about an individual case. Do you believe Nazism is only when someone raises a hand? I believe Nazism is when, under the guise of some new developments, hatred ideology is being implemented that destroys the consciousness of children. In my view, that's also a manifestation of neo-Nazism of modern days. All these narratives around gender and segregation based on the principle of superiority and exclusiveness. That's happening on the level of an entire state. This destructive man-hatred ideology is being implemented. Where were you when we were talking about it in the previous years? I absolutely agree with you, Madam Zakharova. And would you allow a second question? The U.S. is now eliminating the traces of the work of the USAID in Russia. Can the Russian MFA give an expert assessment of the harm of the activities of USAID and its influence on the Constitution of Russia? We gave our assessment back in 2012 when we banned the work of this agency in our country. The rest is a question that should be addressed to the lawyers. As for our position, we formulated it and we adopted the respective decision back in 2012, and then we simply commented on the harmful activities of this organization. And in 2020, when you gave your assessment, did it contain the assessment of its impact on our constitution? There was a comment regarding its impact on the internal situation in our country on the whole. We said they were doing something they were not supposed to do. Thank you so much. Let me clarify once again. Rudolf, are you with us? Almayadin? Then that's it for today. Any more questions? Have I skipped someone? Who are you? Please. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. 1.5 years, our long telephone conversation. It is something that it was long awaited by the entire world. The entire world was commenting on it. As for the reaction of Western leaders after 1.5 hour long conversation, what happened? So what's your question? How can you comment on the reaction of the Western leaders? So it's not important when they felt after the phone conversation. It's important from the point of view of the root causes of the current states. And the root causes, the origins, is what we keep talking about, the loss of sovereignty, the loss of the identity, the loss of the independence, the loss of the very possibility to implement their national interests. In essence, using the Western language, their democracy has failed. It's no longer working. It is something different. Those are vassal relations. Can democracy and vassal relations coexist? Of course not. Democracy is when the people delegate through specific procedures, specific tasks to those whom the people has elected. And those who have been entrusted with its responsibility should act in the interest of the people. So democracy can be different. It can be ancient democracy, while the modern stage it can be added with traditions, with certain accomplishments. But if you look at the EU countries, you'll see anything political technologies, intrigues and scandals, dirty games, but it lacks the most essential thing. It lacks a democratic toolbox in order to implement the aspirations of the peoples of these countries through electoral procedures. What we see is brainwashing, fooling the use of technological manipulations. But what people need is not happening, because what they try to delegate is not considered by the political regime, it's not taken on board by the political regimes, and political regimes do everything to make sure that peoples in their countries don't understand what's happening. Hence, rewriting of history. Hence, the narratives about gender and all the rights they try to impose on their people. To make sure the people lose touch with reality. That's the root cause. That's what's terrible. We are talking about entire states. Many of them are ancient states with a long history. Those are the countries that where the origin of the very notion of democracy and world religions, and gave the world classic literature, music, arts, and now they've turned into immature retranslators, into silent megaphones, or just translators of the will of their big brother from across the ocean. That's it from my part. All the best and see you soon.